Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Good evening. My name is Lucy. I know you must receive thousands of stories, but I need to tell mine. It's not to scare anyone, I think. It's more of an outlet, an attempt to get out something that corrodes me from inside. I've been following your channel for a long time, and the way you treat these accounts gave me courage. Honestly, I never thought that one day I'd be here on the other side, writing. It's just that to this day, there's a part of me that refuses to believe that all of that was real. But it was, and the weight of it doesn't go away. Until a few years ago, my life was the most ordinary thing in the world. My husband Rodney and I lived on a small farm, a quiet little place at the end of a dirt road that got bad every time it rained hard. It was a simple brick house that his father helped us build when we got married. It had a big yard in front with 2 persimmon trees where we'd sit in the late afternoon. Life was good, without luxury, you understand. Rodney took construction work, some renovations here and there. I took care of our little vegetable garden and made cornbread and pound cake to sell at the city farmers market every Saturday. We got by well, didn't owe anything to anyone. It was a peace that today I understand had a price. Our only close neighbors were Chester and his wife, Judith. Their house was a little further down the path, about 200 yards maybe. You could see the roof from our backyard. We got along very well, or I thought we did. They were the type of friends who become family. How many times didn't Rodney borrow a tool from Chester, or I asked Judith for some bay leaves because mine had run out? That was the routine, having coffee on their porch, them coming to eat chicken and okra at our house on Sundays. A friendship of years, the kind you think nothing can shake. Chester had always been more to himself, quiet, a man of few words but very hardworking. Nobody could complain about that. I never saw real malice in him. What I noticed sometimes, and that only makes sense today, was the way he looked. It wasn't a man's look at a woman, nothing like that. It was at things. He had a heavy, deep, intense look, as if he were measuring the weight of everything, the value. I'd see him standing in the middle of his coffee field, just staring at nothing for minutes on end. Once, Rodney even joked that Chester talked to the coffee plants. At the time I laughed, thought it was just his way, country people who live more inward than outward. Today I know it wasn't with the coffee plants that he talked. It was the beginning of everything, and I, in my innocence, saw nothing. The first time peace truly ended was on a June night about 2 years ago. We had made a bonfire in the yard, a little folk festival just for us, something very simple. We invited Judith and Chester, plus a couple of our friends from the city. There was mulled wine, sweet corn pudding, Rodney trying some tunes on the guitar, that good atmosphere, you know. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the cold air called for the warmth of the fire. Everything seemed perfect, the way life should be. Later on, the corn pudding ran out, and I went into the house to get the other pot that was on the wood stove. I left the living room door open and could hear the sound of conversations and laughter from the folks outside, all muffled by distance and walls. When I turned with the hot pot between 2 dish towels, Chester was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had entered without me hearing a single step. He was alone. "Lucy," he called, and his voice came out low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the party. "I need to tell you something." I felt something strange, but tried not to show it. I forced a smile. "Tell me what, Chester? Did something happen? Is Judith looking for you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, normal. He ignored my questions, took 2 steps inside, and the smell of smoke and alcohol coming from his clothes seemed to take over the air. He stopped too close, the kind of close that makes you hold your breath and want to step back, but your legs don't obey. "It's not about Judith," he said, and looked at me in a way I had never seen in all those years. It wasn't desire, it wasn't anger, it was an owner's look. It was the same way he looked at a piece of land he wanted to buy. "I think about you too much. I even dream about you." The world seemed to stop for an instant. His words didn't match the figure of the quiet neighbor, my friend's husband. It seemed like another person was using his mouth to speak, a person I didn't know and didn't want to know. "Chester, please, don't say something like that," was the only thing I managed to say, and my voice barely came out. "Your wife is right there. My husband is outside. We're friends, for God's sake." He just kept staring at me for seconds that wouldn't end, his face without a single expression. He didn't seem to have heard or didn't care about what I said. It was like talking to a stone wall. After a while, he just nodded slightly, turned around, and left the kitchen. A second later, I heard his voice outside, normal, laughing at a joke Rodney told. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen with the pot cooling in my hands, trying to understand what had happened. My heart raced all wrong. The first thing I thought was to go outside and drag Rodney to a corner, tell him everything. But then I imagined the scene. Rodney, with the hot blood he has, would confront him right then and there. It would turn into an ugly fight, maybe even something worse. It would end the friendship, the peace of the neighborhood. I thought maybe he had drunk too much, that the mulled wine went to his head, and he spoke without thinking. I decided the best thing was to let it go, forget what I heard. That was my first, and perhaps the worst of all my mistakes. I spent the following days forcing myself not to think about it. Every time I saw Chester from afar, hoeing his garden or fixing the fence, I felt a bad chill and looked away. I kept myself busy with something inside the house. He and Judith came to have coffee with us the following Sunday, as if absolutely nothing had happened. He barely spoke to me, acted like the same old Chester, quiet and respectful. On one hand, it was a relief. On the other, it made the whole thing seem even more bizarre, like a dirty secret only I carried. It was on Tuesday that I noticed something missing. It was a hair clip, a plastic barrette, one of those very common ones, but it had enormous value to me. It had been a gift from my mother, the last thing she gave me before she passed away. I wore that clip every single day to hold my hair while cooking or going to take care of the chickens. It was an automatic gesture. I searched the whole house, went through drawers, looked in the bathroom in the apron pockets. Nothing. The last time I remembered using it was on the day of the party. I thought it must have fallen somewhere in the yard. I didn't give it proper importance at first, but that same night the dreams began. And they weren't normal nightmares with monsters or falls. They were worse because they were silent. In the first one, I felt I wasn't alone in the room. I'd open my eyes in the darkness and see Chester's silhouette standing at the foot of our bed. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. His face was a dark blur, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was him. I tried to scream, tried to poke Rodney, who slept heavily beside me, but my voice wouldn't come out, my body wouldn't move. I'd wake up suddenly, with my heart almost coming out through my mouth, my whole body locked and drenched in sweat. This repeated for 3 nights in a row. The dream was always the same, but each night a detail became clearer, more horrible. On the second night, in the dream, his mouth was open as if a mute scream were trapped in his throat. On the third, his eyes were 2 white, milky things without life. I woke up more and more exhausted, as if I had spent the night awake, with a dull ache in my muscles. At the same time, Bruno, our dog, became unrecognizable. He was a mutt we'd had since he was a puppy, a clingy dog who always slept on an old rug by the kitchen door. Suddenly, he refused to enter the house, would balk at the doorway and whimper. No prayer would make him come in. If we forced him, he'd run outside at the first chance. And he started barking. He'd bark at a specific corner of the kitchen, near the cupboard where I kept the cornmeal bags. He'd bark with the hair on his neck all bristled, a desperate bark of someone who sees a real threat. We'd look, turn on the light, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing. During the day, paranoia started getting to me. When I went to hang clothes on the line in the back, I felt that chill on the back of my neck, the certainty that someone was watching me from the woods that surrounded the farm. I turned around quickly, but only saw the swaying of trees and heard the singing of crickets. The feeling, however, didn't pass. It was as if Chester's eyes, those heavy eyes from the kitchen, had stuck to me, following me everywhere. By this point, I no longer had any doubt. It wasn't drink, it wasn't something in my head. I knew something was terribly wrong. Things started changing inside the house, and it wasn't suddenly, it was gradually, in a sneaky way that almost made me think I was going crazy. First was the smell. A constant smell of dampness, of wet earth after heavy rain. Only this smell wouldn't go away. Even on the hottest, driest days, with all the windows open, the smell was there, as if it were impregnated in the walls, in the sheets. Then came the food. Fresh milk I bought from neighbors would curdle overnight in the refrigerator. Bread would mold at absurd speed. Once I made a batch of cornbread for Saturday's market, and when I woke up the next day, the pan was covered by a thin layer of greenish mold I had never seen. I had to throw everything away. The last straw was the coffee. Our coffee, the same one we had harvested, dried, and ground for years, started tasting like dirt. I felt it, and Rodney did too. He even joked that I must be using rainwater to brew it, but we both knew that wasn't it. It was around this time that Rodney started getting sick. It began with tiredness that wouldn't pass, a weakness that stuck to his body. He'd wake up more tired than when he went to bed. Then came the pains, a constant, dull pain in his muscles, as if he had spent the day carrying stones. He, who had always been a strong man who never stayed still, barely had the energy to get out of bed some days. He lost his appetite. My cooking, which he had always praised, now he barely touched on his plate. "I don't know, Lucy, it has a strange taste," he'd say, pushing the rice around with his fork. "It's like there's sand in the beans." That turned my stomach. He was feeling the same earthy taste I was. Weeks passed like this until I took him to the city health clinic. The doctor asked a bunch of questions, felt his belly, ordered a complete blood test. A week later, the results came. There was nothing, absolutely nothing wrong. The doctor said it might be stress, maybe a more resistant virus. He prescribed some vitamins and sent us home. But he didn't get better, on the contrary, and the house seemed to get sick along with him. Dark stains started appearing on the kitchen and bedroom walls. At first, they were just little spots of moisture, but over time they spread, stretching like someone had run dirty, greasy fingers over the paint. I'd scrub with bleach, and for a day they'd disappear. But then they'd come back, always in the same place, a little bigger. At night, the noises were no longer the normal creaks of roof wood adjusting to the cold. It was a different sound, a dragged, heavy sound coming from the ceiling, like someone was pulling a full sack from one side to the other very slowly. I'd lie awake looking at the ceiling, afraid even to breathe. Poor Rodney slept a heavy but restless sleep, muttering words I didn't understand. I didn't tell him anything about my suspicions, about Chester, about the hair clip. How was I going to approach my sick husband and say I thought the neighbor was doing witchcraft on us? He'd think I'd lost my mind. And to be honest, part of me was still afraid that's exactly what it was. Rodney continued to lose weight. His face, which had always been round and rosy, became thin with a yellowish, sickly color. His hair started falling out, not much, but enough for us to notice the strands on the pillow every morning. That strong man, full of life, was fading before my eyes, and there was no doctor or medicine that could help. We no longer received visitors. The atmosphere of the house was so heavy that people seemed to feel it from far away. The turning point came when Rodney's godmother, an elderly lady named Isabel, showed up unannounced on a Sunday afternoon. She came in, gave Rodney a tight hug, and was silent for a while, just observing the environment, her godson's face, the stains on the wall. Before leaving, she pulled me aside on the porch. "My daughter listened to me," she said, holding my arm with a firmness that surprised me. "This here isn't a doctor's illness. This is something done. It's the evil eye of the worst kind. Someone has very bad thoughts about you too. You need to look for Miss Nanda in New Village. Take a piece of Rodney's clothing. Go soon. Don't let this shadow grow any more." I had never been one to believe much in these things, but desperation was so great that her words sounded like the only possible answer. The next morning I took the first bus to the city. Miss Nanda's house was at the end of a dirt street, a very humble place, but the yard was a garden full of pots with rue, guinea grass, pepper plants, a good smell of clean herbs. The house was small but impeccably clean inside. Miss Nanda was an elderly black woman with very lively, attentive eyes. She had me sit down and asked almost no questions. She just looked at me for a while, as if reading something in me. "Take off your shoes and close your eyes, girl," was all she said. She took a fresh white egg and began passing it over my whole body, from head to toe, while praying quietly in words I didn't understand, a mixture of Catholic prayer with something else, older. I felt the egg getting heavy in her hand as it passed over me. Then she took a glass of water and very carefully broke the egg into it. I opened my eyes. What I saw inside that glass made my stomach turn. The white wasn't transparent. It was cloudy, full of thin, dark threads like spider veins. The yolk sank and had a black spot in the middle, and from it rose tiny bubbles as if the water were boiling in slow motion. In the middle of the yolk, the black spot looked like an eye, a closed eye watching me. "Hail Mary," Miss Nanda whispered, making the sign of the cross. She turned to me, her face very serious. "My daughter, they did strong work on you. They used something of yours from your body to tie you up and mixed it with earth from a heavy place, earth that doesn't see the sun. Someone took a hair of yours, a piece of clothing. Think carefully, someone who wants you harm touched you lately. At that instant, the image of my mother's hair clip that never appeared again, and Chester's face that night in the kitchen came to my head with a clarity that hurt. I wasn't crazy. All of that was real. I told Miss Nanda everything about Chester, about the clip, about the dreams. She listened to everything in silence, nodding slowly as if she already expected it. Her expression wasn't one of surprise, it was of deep, tired sadness. The evil has already taken root, my daughter, she said. What this man did was just open the gate. What came in behind is older and hungrier than he is, but we're not giving up. She gave me the first instructions. She handed me a small black cloth bag, hand-sewn. It had coarse salt, a piece of charcoal, and a garlic clove inside. It was an amulet. Put this behind your front door and don't let anyone touch it. Today when the sun is setting, you're going to burn garlic peels and a sprig of rue in every room. Start with the last bedroom and finish at the front door. While the smoke rises, pray what you know, ask for protection. But I warn you, this won't break what was done. It's just to create a barrier, to push the shadow away for a while. And stay alert, because the thing won't like being bothered. I returned home with a fear I could barely stand, a mixture of fear and a tiny bit of hope. Rodney was lying down, apathetic. I did everything exactly as she told me. I nailed the cloth bag behind the door. I waited for the sun to go down, that orange, sad light of late afternoon, and lit the garlic peels with the rue in an old can. The moment the first smoke rose, a cold wind passed through the house, whistling through the cracks. All the doors slammed at once with a force that made the whole house shake. Bruno, who was tied up in the yard, started barking and howling desperately, a sound of pure terror. I went from room to room, the smoke burning my eyes, the can trembling in my hand. When I finished in the living room, I went to close the kitchen window, and that's when I saw it. On the windowsill outside, there was a little doll made of corn husks tied with red thread. It was crude, poorly made, but I knew what that was. It was a message, an insult, an anger I didn't know I had rose up my throat. I took the doll, threw it inside the can with the burning herbs, and watched it writhe and turn to ash. I was challenging that thing. I was going to protect my home and my husband, and that was the worst thing I could have done. That night the retaliation came, and it wasn't for me, it was for him. In the middle of the night, I woke up with Rodney thrashing in bed. It wasn't a nightmare. His eyes were open wide, but they saw nothing. His body arched backward, all muscles tense, and from his mouth came a guttural sound, a low growl. I tried to hold him, called his name, but he seemed deaf. "Rodney, for God's sake, it's me, Lucy," I screamed, crying. He stopped thrashing and slowly turned his face in my direction. But it wasn't Rodney looking at me, it was something else. A smile opened on his face, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and with a voice that was and wasn't his, thicker, dragged, he said a single sentence. "She shouldn't have burned it." After that, his body went limp, and he fell back on the pillow in deep sleep. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the room, hugging my knees, shaking nonstop. That drop of hope I had was extinguished. I had tried to fight, and the only thing I accomplished was making that thing hurt my husband even more. I understood the message. Every time I tried to react, he would pay the price. After that night, I surrendered. Not in the sense of giving myself to evil, but I stopped fighting. I gave up. I put the herb-burning can at the bottom of the closet. I stopped praying out loud. My only objective, the only thing that made me get out of bed, was taking care of Rodney, bathing him, making him swallow a little soup, changing his clothes. I acted like a nurse in a private hospital where the only patient was my husband, and the disease had no name or cure. And then something strange happened. The house quieted down. The noises in the ceiling stopped. The stains on the wall stopped growing, became stagnant like scars. Rodney had no more attacks. He continued the same way, weak, airy, with a lost look most of the time, but the aggressiveness had disappeared. It was a rotten calm, a sickly peace like the silence that remains after a devastating storm. It was as if the thing that inhabited our life had gotten what it wanted and was now just enjoying the victory. This silence was 1,000 times more terrifying than the screams and slamming doors. About 3 or 4 weeks passed like this, in this gray routine, and I started feeling sick, nausea that caught me by surprise in the morning, dizziness that came out of nowhere and made me have to lean against the wall so I wouldn't fall. At first, I refused to think about it. I blamed stress, poor nutrition, badly slept nights. The last thing that crossed my mind was the other possibility. It didn't make sense. We no longer had a husband and wife life since Rodney really got sick. On a Saturday at the farmer's market, Mrs. Elvira, a lady who sells vegetables at the stand across from mine, looked at me and said, "Lucy, my daughter, you have a face, that paleness. It's either worms or a baby." She laughed, an innocent joke from a good person, but the word baby kept hammering in my head the rest of the day. On Monday, I made up that I needed to buy thread in the city. I left Rodney with a plate of food and a glass of water beside him and went to the pharmacy. I had never felt so much shame and fear in my life as when I asked the girl at the counter for the test. I hid the little box at the bottom of my bag as if it were a crime and returned home with my heart in my mouth. I locked the bathroom door. My hands shook so much I could barely open the package. I took the test, put it face down on the sink, and waited. Those were the longest and most silent 5 minutes of my entire life. When I picked up the plastic strip and turned it over, there they were, 2 strong, clear, unmistakable red lines. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just slid down the wall and sat on the cold bathroom floor. And a coldness that wasn't of this world took over me inside. It wasn't the joy I had dreamed of feeling one day if this happened. That's when everything fell into place. Everything, absolutely everything, made sense. Chester's obsession, the theft of my hair clip, the bond, Rodney's weakening, taking the man out of the house, out of the way, the sudden calm. That thing never wanted to kill me, never wanted just to haunt us. It wanted to be born. It wanted a body, an air, an anchor to establish itself in this world. And it was using my womb to build its house. That work was never about death. It was a creation ritual. And the evil, the true evil, was no longer in the ceiling or on the walls. It was growing inside me. I didn't tell anyone about the pregnancy. My belly grew under loose dresses and Rodney's indifference. I didn't go to a doctor, didn't do prenatal care. I was terrified of what an ultrasound might show. The months passed in a fog of fear and resignation. The movements inside me weren't kicks from a normal baby. They were different. They were like slow, rhythmic pressures, as if something were stretching, testing the limits of space. Sometimes it seemed like a wave, something that moved from one side to the other, smooth and heavy. The night everything happened began with light rain that soon turned into a storm with winds that seemed to want to tear off the roof. And along with the storm, the pains began, and the house woke up. The noise in the ceiling returned, but now it wasn't dragging. It was a sound of frantic claws scratching the wood. The lights flickered and soon went out completely. The windows banged with the wind, and the stains on the walls seemed to pulse in the dark, darker than the night itself. I was alone. Rodney, who had spent the whole day sitting in a chair staring at nothing, got up when the first stronger pain hit me. But he didn't come to help me. He went to the front door, opened the latch, and stood there, back to me, like a guard. A dark silhouette against the lightning flashes. I can't say how long it lasted. It was hours of pain and terror, with the sounds of the house and storm mixing with my moans. And at some point, at the height of a contraction I thought would split me in two, everything stopped. The pain, the rain, the wind, the noises. An absolute silence, heavy as if the world had ended. And in the middle of that silence I heard a sound. It wasn't a cry, it was a sigh. A single, long, satisfied sigh. When I managed to gather strength to light a candle, I saw him. He was there, wrapped in the blanket I had set aside. He was a perfect boy with dark skin and a tuft of straight black hair. But he didn't cry, he was with open eyes, staring at me. And those eyes weren't from a newborn. They were eyes of old people, of those who already know things. The candle went out, and when morning came, Rodney wasn't there anymore. The front door remained open. That was almost a year ago. The child, I never gave him a name, grows fast, is quiet, serious. He doesn't play, spends hours sitting on the floor just observing things. Sometimes I catch him talking to himself, but they're not baby words. It's a low, guttural murmur in a language that isn't ours. The house returned to silence, but it's his silence now. Chester and Judith moved away a few months after the birth. They left suddenly, sold the farm for almost nothing. I never heard from them again. Sometimes I wonder if they fled in fear of what they helped create, or if they were simply dismissed like a tool that's no longer useful. Sometimes strange people appear at the gate, people I've never seen in my life. They don't call me, don't try to enter. They stand for a few minutes looking at the house and then leave. Occasionally, they leave things at the foot of the fence. A bunch of perfectly ripe small bananas, a dead bird with open wings, a smooth stone with a hole in the middle. Offerings. I tried to leave once. I gathered our few things in a bag while he slept, but when I went to get him from the crib, he wasn't there. The crib was empty. I panicked, searched the whole house. Only when I undid the bag and put the clothes back in the drawer did I hear murmuring in the crib again. He had returned. The house doesn't let me leave. He doesn't let me leave. And Rodney, I see him from time to time. When I look through the kitchen window, I see a figure standing far away in the middle of the coffee field where the land starts going up the hill. It's him. I know it's him. He just stands there, motionless, a human scarecrow watching his own house, his own son, his own disgrace. He's the one who takes care of everything now. And I am the cage. I didn't have a son. What was born from me was my prison. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I was never good at following orders, especially when they came from my mother. Ever since I was little, something inside me rebelled against any command, as if contradicting authority was my way of signing my existence. It wasn't out of malice or spite. Something just ignited within me whenever I heard "do this" or "don't do that." But there was one particular instruction that repeated every afternoon, a rule that wasn't just my mother's, but belonged to the entire town of Cedar Falls, Oregon. "Before 7 o'clock, Michael. Before the sun goes down," she'd say with a tone that wasn't quite scolding, but wasn't a suggestion either. It was a mixture of pleading and fear, as if those words had accompanied her since childhood, an inherited warning carved into her bones. She never explained why, and nobody else did either. We just knew that when the clock struck 5, children had to be inside their houses, doors locked tight, and no one should be wandering the streets. No one questioned it. No one doubted. It was an unwritten law, as old as the Douglas firs, that surrounded our small logging town. I returned many years later, driven by a sad and predictable reason: my father's death. He died as he lived, quietly, without asking for help, without bothering anyone. He passed away alone in the same house where we'd spent the best and worst days of my childhood. The funeral was small, intimate. A few neighbors came, a distant aunt I barely remembered, a couple of men who had once worked with him at the mill. Few words, many silences, gazes that seemed to know me better than I remembered them. I'd left so young that over the years, the faces of the town had become ghostly, blurred. Sometimes I wonder if I forgot them because of time, or because something in me decided to leave them behind, like someone closing a door and never looking back. Now, with my father dead, I decided to stay a few more days to keep my mother company. She's still there, firm as an old rock that has weathered all storms. She acts strong, but I know she doesn't want to be alone in the house. The house, despite the passage of time, remains standing. The damp walls and high ceilings hold the smell of confinement, wet earth, old junk, and unworn clothes. It was as if the house breathed deeply with each step I took, as if it recognized my footsteps and reminded me that I too belonged to it. I settled into the room that had been mine since childhood. Now it seemed smaller, quieter. I had no plans to stay too long. Settle legal matters, pack what was necessary, throw away what was useless. But soon I understood that the house doesn't let itself be emptied so easily. Every corner held something, and every object carried the weight of a story I no longer knew how to tell. Mom helped me with what she could, but mostly she just sat there watching me in silence, as if she knew that sooner or later, something that was sleeping would wake up. It was one night, while I was organizing the room we used as storage, that I found the photograph. That space was chaos: tools, documents, rusty cans, old blankets, and poorly closed cardboard boxes. Dad had turned that room into a small refuge of useful things and not so useful things, depending on who was looking. I was taking everything out, box after box, organizing what was useful and what could be donated or simply thrown away. In one of those boxes, among folded papers and an old flashlight that no longer worked, I found an old cardboard envelope. Inside, several photographs. Those from before, with white borders and faded colors, that over the years turn yellowish like dry leaves. Most were family portraits. Me mounted on a horse that had once belonged to my grandfather, smiling with my face full of dust and my pants rolled up. Mom hanging clothes in the yard with her apron tied around her waist. Dad with his checkered shirt, an eternal cigarette between his fingers, leaning against the fence as if time didn't weigh on him. Nothing out of the ordinary until that one appeared. It was a photo of me as a child. I must have been about 8 years old, maybe younger. I was next to the old swing, the one that hung from the oak tree that's still in the backyard. I was smiling, looking straight ahead as if someone had called me just before taking the photo. But it wasn't my face that froze my blood. It was what appeared in the background. It was barely visible among the trees, out of focus but unmistakable. A humanoid figure, tall, thin, with strange proportions, as if a person's shadow had been stretched until it deformed. And it wasn't alone. There was another and another. 3 in total, or at least that's what I managed to count before feeling something tight in my chest. I felt a dry chill, as if the photo was looking back at me. It was like a sharp blow to memory, a recollection that had been sleeping for years, awakening suddenly with the violence of a poorly healed wound. It was a new image, yet I had already lived it, and I had already been there. And the fear returned with the same force as that afternoon. That afternoon, I disobeyed the rule for the first and only time. I didn't return home on time. I stayed playing alone, throwing stones at the dry creek, trapped in that childish world where time escapes without warning. I felt no hunger, no cold, no hurry. I just played, and when I realized it, the sun had already set behind the hills. The light had changed tone. It was that moment of the day when everything seems more distant, more unreal, with a light that seems borrowed from the bottom of the sea. And then I saw them. At first I thought it was my imagination, shadows among the trees, but they weren't branches or trunks or birds in motion. They were figures. They emerged from among the trunks with terrible calm. They didn't walk. They didn't float. They glided as if the ground itself was pushing them toward me. Terror filled me completely. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran with my whole body trembling and my arms cutting through the air. I ran like never before, crossing the thickets. The path was paved with loose stones. I ran crying, screaming without voice. I felt them coming behind me, breathing down my neck. I don't know how long it took, but when I got home, Mom was already at the door waiting for me. Her eyes were teary, her shawl clutched in her arms as if she were holding someone invisible. She hugged me so tight I felt like I was going to break. She said nothing and just pulled me into the house. She locked the door with a double bolt and turned off all the lights. That night she slept sitting next to my bed. We never talked about it again, neither she nor I, never again. Over time, I thought I had dreamed it, that it had been a product of fear, of disobedience, of my childish imagination. Until I saw that photo. Until I understood that I hadn't invented it and that it was all true. Now I understand why my mother repeated that warning with such determination. It wasn't a simple rule or a town superstition. It was a plea, a desperate attempt to protect us from something we didn't understand, something that perhaps still lurks among the corners of the day, waiting for the light to begin withdrawing from the world. No matter how much time has passed or how many things have changed, there are presences that don't understand calendars and simply remain lurking, faithful to their hour. And Mom, who sometimes stands looking out the window as if waiting for something that never quite arrives, never spoke of it again either, as if she too knew that there are things that don't need explanation and only need silence. I can't help but think about what dwells among the trees when evening falls, about that which cannot be named, but which everyone in town learned to fear without anyone explaining it to us. Maybe it's not important to understand what they are. Maybe it's enough to know they exist. I'm writing from Portland to tell you about something that happened to some friends and me a while back. It all began during a visit to a cemetery. Everything started one night during a gathering with friends, one of those meetings where you talk about everything and nothing at the same time. We were having a great time when suddenly one of them asked something that made us all fall silent. "Who else is in the house?" Since I was the hostess, I replied that there was no one else, but he insisted. I saw a shadow pass by the patio. It was tall, very tall. I told him it was probably the dog, but he shook his head. According to him, the silhouette had no animal shape. We didn't give it much importance, but his comment was the starting point for us to begin telling horror stories. Among those present was a friend whose brother had taken his own life approximately 2 years earlier. Since then, her family had been left with many doubts and unanswered questions. She spoke frequently about the sadness, the emptiness, the shadow that this event had cast over all of them. This tragedy had marked them and still haunted them. That night, past 10 o'clock, she proposed something unexpected. What if we go to the cemetery to visit my brother? The cemetery she was referring to is located in a small town outside Portland. Out of respect and safety, I'll omit the name of the place. We were so caught up in the conversation, so intoxicated by the paranormal, that we all accepted. So we got in the car and left. The drive took about 35 minutes. It was a clear night, and the full moon illuminated everything with supernatural clarity. In that town, there's no nightlife. People go to bed early, so it wasn't strange that when we arrived, there wasn't a soul on the street. Everything was in complete silence. The cemetery, being in a small town, doesn't have high walls or padlocks, just low stone borders surrounding it, and the metal gate was slightly ajar. We entered, of course, with great respect. We didn't want to disturb or damage anything. We walked among the graves, guided by moonlight and a small flashlight. We found my friend's brother's grave without difficulty. We stopped for a few minutes in front of it. The air was cool, the atmosphere serene, too serene. We felt a strange calm, a calm that seemed to contain something more, something that couldn't be seen but could be felt. We decided to leave so as not to bother anyone or get into trouble. Upon leaving, the wind was blowing strong, and only the distant barking of some dogs could be heard. We sat for a few moments on a stone wall right in front of the cemetery. The town's streetlights flickered with that orange, dying light. It was then that we heard it, a dry, repetitive, unmistakable sound. It was the sound of a shovel hitting earth. At first we doubted and thought maybe it was the wind moving some broken window or a loose headstone. But no, we all heard it clearly. It was a shovel breaking the humid earth, slow and clumsy. We looked at each other, and no one said anything. We simply ran toward the car and started it up. We had barely advanced a few yards when something made us turn instinctively toward the cemetery, and then we saw it. A shadow, but not a person, and not an animal either. It was a gigantic figure, dark as coal, that leaped over the stones that surrounded the cemetery. It had no face or defined shape. It was just there, motionless, observing us, as if it couldn't leave the limits of the cemetery, as if it had been waiting for us from the moment we entered. We left without looking back, and since then, every time I remember that night, I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed one more minute, if we had ignored that noise, or if the shadow had managed to get out. The drive back to Portland was silent, except for the radio playing softly in the background. None of us spoke about what we'd seen until we were safely back in the city, under streetlights and surrounded by the familiar hum of late-night traffic. When we finally did talk about it, we realized we'd all seen the same thing, that impossible figure that seemed to be made of living darkness, bound to the cemetery, but desperately wanting to follow us. My friend, whose brother we'd gone to visit, was the first to speak. "That wasn't him," she said quietly. "My brother would never try to scare us. That was something else, something that's been there much longer." In the weeks that followed, she began having dreams about her brother. But these were different from the nightmares she'd had since his death. In these dreams, he was trying to warn her about something, pointing toward shadows and shaking his head urgently. She'd wake up with the distinct feeling that he was trying to protect her from whatever we'd disturbed that night. We never spoke about returning to that cemetery, but the experience changed something in all of us. We'd crossed a line between the world of the living and something far older and more dangerous. The shadow we'd seen wasn't just a guardian of the dead. It was a predator, something that fed on the boundary between life and death. My recommendation is this: never, under any circumstances, visit a cemetery at night. It doesn't matter how pure your intentions are. You don't know what might be waiting for you in the darkness, and some things that sleep in consecrated ground are better left undisturbed. Some hungers are patient, and some shadows cast themselves long enough to follow you home. My name is Alina. I'm 29 years old and I live in Denver, Colorado, where the heat sticks to your skin like a second shadow, and the concrete never cools down. From my apartment on the 7th floor, I can see the Rocky Mountains rising on the horizon like a sleeping beast. Sometimes I think those mountains are the only thing that has been constant in my life, but lately I've begun to feel that I'm not the one observing the landscape, but rather it's the landscape, or something within it, that's watching me. Something that doesn't come from the sky or the earth, but from a place that has no name. Since I was little, I've been able to see things that others cannot see. At first, when I was very small, I thought they were games of my imagination, shapes that slipped between the corners of my room, shadows, whispers, things that my parents attributed to strange dreams or too much television. But it wasn't that. Those visions grew with me. They were no longer glimpses at the edges of my vision or vague figures that disappeared if I looked at them directly. They became presences. I see entities walking among us, as if they had always belonged to the same world as us, only they're hidden beneath the surface of the everyday. Some have a humanoid appearance, like hunched elderly people with completely black eyes, children who smile without blinking, women who move without touching the ground. Others have no form. They're like bags of shadow that crawl along walls or float above ceilings. They're twisted, slow, but charged with a threatening energy. I see them, and I've always seen them. The most terrifying thing is when they get too close, when I feel them pass through me without touching me, when they know what I think, what I fear, and what I hide. I remember one particular occasion, an ordinary day on the light rail. It was rush hour, and Union Station was packed with people entering and leaving without looking at anyone. I was gripping the handrail of the car when I saw him. A common man in a suit and tie, any executive with his laptop bag hanging from his shoulder. But what froze me was what he had behind him. A shadow attached to his back as if it grew from him. Its eyes glowed with a sickly tone, and its mouth was sealed like some kind of black stitching. Every time the man spoke on the phone, the shadow writhed as if it were suffering, as if the words caused it pain. I couldn't stop staring at them. The man noticed my gaze and smiled at me, but that smile wasn't his. It was crooked, false, and inhuman. It was the shadow that was smiling through him. From that day on, I understood that not all bodies are empty. Some are already occupied. It was then that I began to doubt everything. Who is really alone? Who walks with a borrowed or manipulated soul? There are people who, when I look at them, sense something strange, a weight, a distortion in the air, as if their humanity were tinted with something else. I realized that some people are no longer just people. They carry something on top of or inside them, as if they were containers for something that doesn't belong to them. I don't always notice it at first glance. Sometimes it takes minutes, and other times a single exchange of looks is enough. Before, I could differentiate what was real from what wasn't. I knew when I was seeing something supernatural and when I was talking to a person of flesh and blood. But that changed. Everything became blurred. Recently, for example, while standing in line at the supermarket, a white-haired woman spoke to me about the rain. I responded politely, but I felt a strange cold on my back. When I turned to look for her again, she was no longer there. I asked the lady behind me if she had seen the woman, and she looked at me confused. No one else had noticed her. Sometimes I think she was never there, or worse, that she's still there, but not in the place where my eyes look for her. I don't just see them, I also feel them, and that's the most exhausting part. It's as if my body knew before my mind when something wasn't right. My skin crawls, my hands sweat, my stomach churns. Some presences carry anger, others sadness, others simply emptiness. But there are some that are different, silent, inert. They don't want to be seen, don't want to be felt, and don't want to be understood either. Those are the ones I fear most, because their intention doesn't manifest itself. It simply exists. It just waits, and I'm terrified to think about what exactly they're waiting for. I've tried to understand what's happening to me. I've gone to psychics, to shamans in other states. I've also visited psychologists, and I even entered a church after more than 10 years without setting foot in one. None gave me a clear answer. Some told me I was blessed with a gift, as if it were something wonderful. Others insinuated that I have a curse, or that I opened a door I shouldn't have. My psychologists talked about stress, sensory disorders, trauma. No one helped me. No one gave me peace, and no explanations either. I have a partner who has been my refuge. He doesn't see what I see, but he believes me. He has witnessed episodes where I scream while sleeping or lock myself in the bathroom, crying for no apparent reason. He hugs me without asking and strokes my hair until I can breathe again. I don't know how he's managed it. I think he senses that this isn't something that can be cured, it can only be endured. There was one particular night I'll never forget. It was raining hard, and thunder made the windows of the apartment vibrate. I fell asleep on the couch, and when I woke up, I felt something watching me from the hallway. Nothing could be seen, but the air had weight, as if someone had sat on my chest. I got up trembling and went to the kitchen for water. In the reflection of the window, I saw a figure behind me. It didn't scream, didn't move, didn't disappear. It was just there still. It watched me with the same intensity with which I watched it. I didn't dare turn around. I just closed my eyes. When I opened them, the figure was no longer there, but the air was still tense, as if it had left something behind. I haven't slept well in years. I wake up drenched in sweat, with the sensation of having dreamed something terrible, but I don't remember details either. They're just loose images, a face without eyes, a dry forest, a clock running backward. Sometimes I hear a voice telling me that none of this is real, and that I'm not real either, that what I see isn't a curse, but a truth that no one else can bear. I've tried to close my eyes, pray, ignore it, anesthetize myself with music, movies, medication. Nothing works. They're always there, sometimes more present than real people, sometimes more consistent than reality itself. And the worst of all is that there are moments when I feel something is following me, not obviously, with footsteps or shadows. It's more intimate, as if part of me no longer belonged entirely to me. Like when I leave the street or cross a sidewalk, something slides behind me, maintaining my rhythm, imitating my movements with disturbing patience. There are no clear signs, but my body knows it. A light pressure in the chest, a tremor in the hands for no apparent reason. It's as if I were carrying someone with me, stuck to the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to lower my guard. And every time it gets harder to distinguish if that something is outside, or if it has already entered. I don't know how to stop it. I don't know if it can be stopped. So I just keep going forward, pretending normalcy, and hoping they don't take the next step. The mountains that once comforted me now seem to loom closer each day, as if whatever dwells within them grows bolder, more certain of its claim on me. Some mornings I wake up to find dirt under my fingernails, though I haven't been outside. Some nights I catch myself walking toward the window, drawn by a call I can't quite hear. I'm running out of time to figure out what wants me and why. But I'm starting to suspect that the answer might be worse than the question. If anyone can recommend someone who can really help me with what I'm experiencing, please let me know. I would be extremely grateful. My name is Martin, and I'd like to tell you about something that happened to me years ago when I was still in high school. It's not a story I like to remember much, honestly, but every now and then it comes back to my head on its own. It's like a thorn that never quite comes out, stuck in some corner of memory. One of those things you think you've forgotten, but all it takes is a shadow, a sound, or a sleepless night for it to return with full force. Back then I had my group of friends. I was always getting into trouble with Leo, Jonah, Rafe, and me. We were inseparable, those kids who seem to fear nothing, and are always looking for something to do so they don't get bored. We like to go out, wander around the city, get into minor trouble, nothing serious, but enough to feel like we were alive. One Friday afternoon, without much planning, we got the crazy idea to go explore some abandoned buildings that were out on the outskirts of the city, where the wasteland began and streetlights no longer reached. Since we were in middle school, Those buildings had caught our attention because they were right next to the school. Sometimes in class, when we happened to look out the window, you could see among the dry trees those gray masses that seemed to watch us back. Many said the place was haunted, that it was cursed, and the most repeated story was about a couple of teenagers, also students from that middle school, who disappeared one Friday afternoon without a trace. They searched for days until someone found them in one of the complex's cisterns. They were at the bottom, where light barely reaches. The scene, those who knew more would say, was something that couldn't be described. So strong, so out of place, that even the police who arrived first came out pale. It was a scandal at the time. They said no one knew what had happened to them, and there were no arrests. The whole case was closed very quickly. Over time, people started avoiding that place. They said you could feel something strange, heavy there. Those buildings were part of a large project that was supposed to be for workers from a company that no longer exists. They were going to build an entire residential complex, a school, clinic, and even a sports center. But something happened, and we never really knew what, and the work was left half-finished. They left everything abandoned, unfinished structures, rusty iron, naked columns, and soulless concrete. No one went back to work there, and over time the brush began to eat the hallways. The walls filled with graffiti, and all that grew were rumors of strange things. That Friday we arrived around nightfall. It was past 9, and it was hot season, but the air was starting to get cooler with a strange breeze coming from the hills. The sky was overcast, no moon, and you could barely see some stars between the clouds. Each of us carried our backpack with the basics: water, chips, a flashlight just in case. Nothing special. We weren't prepared for anything serious, just to snoop around, as we had done so many times. We entered through one side of the complex, where the wire fence had been broken for years, among the dry bushes and old garbage remains. Everything was abandoned and neglected. Once inside, the first floor received us with heavy silence, and each step we took made the floor creak, as if the building were complaining about having visitors. The walls were full of old graffiti, poorly written names, drawings that couldn't be understood, numbers, profanity. The air was dense and smelled of confinement, damp trap, old junk, and unused clothes. And also, in certain corners, something stronger and uglier, like rotten meat, like a dirty, old hospital. At first, as always, it was all laughter. We made fun of everything, made silly jokes, dared each other to enter the darkest rooms first, played at scaring each other with false noises and screams. We even took a couple of photos, making ridiculous poses. But little by little, as we went up floors, something changed. It wasn't sudden, it was more like a shadow that gradually seeps in. By the 4th floor, the atmosphere felt different. The air was colder, but not normal cold. It was like a basement, like an old refrigerator. Our laughter died down without anyone saying so. We began to notice things that didn't fit. There were black candles melted, placed in a circle. Some were recent, and others were just stains. On the walls there were symbols painted that looked like dried blood. They were shapes we didn't understand: spirals, deformed crosses, dots. It looked like a place where someone or something had performed rituals. In the corner we found an old board like an improvised altar, and on top there were jars with dark earth, small bones, and a rag doll stuck with pins in the eyes and chest. We stood looking at all that without saying a single word. It was as if silence also weighed. We felt something above us, as if the building weren't breathing down our necks. Leo was the first to speak quietly, saying he felt like someone was watching him from the stairs. We laughed half-heartedly, but honestly, I felt it too. It was like a sensation of being exposed, as if we weren't alone, as if someone or something was watching us from the shadows, crouched. I turned off the flashlight for a second to see how dark it really was, and it was like turning off the world. You couldn't hear anything, not a bird, not a leaf moving. Then, out of nowhere, a dry blow was heard upstairs, as if something big had fallen. Then another, louder, and then a stranger noise, as if they were dragging something heavy across the floor. And what finished freezing our blood was a growl. It wasn't a normal animal. It sounded deep, guttural, as if it came from the deepest part of the earth, as if whatever made it had no right to be in this world. Rafe was the first to say we should get out of there, and we listened to him instantly. No one argued, no one wanted to be brave. We started going down the stairs quickly, one behind the other, without saying a single word. That's when a scream was heard, a sharp, long shriek like a woman's, but wrong. It was as if it came from a broken throat, as if it were made of pure hatred. It sounded so loud, so close, that Leo fell from sheer fright, tripping on a step. We picked him up as we could and went down almost pushing each other, without looking back. I felt that if I turned around, there would be something that shouldn't exist, something that would stay with me forever. Already outside, with our bikes thrown on the dry grass and the sun completely set, we stayed for a good while without saying anything, just breathing with our hearts wanting to jump out through our throats. We had cold hands, pale faces. We looked at each other, as if wanting to confirm that we had all seen the same thing. And there, without hesitation, we made the promise to never return, never talk too much about what happened, and we kept it. Each of us went our own way, but when occasionally we write or see each other again, if someone mentions, "Remember the building," we all fall silent. No one laughs and no one asks for more. And I swear to you, without wanting to exaggerate or go around telling tales, there's something in there. Something that doesn't want to be seen, or something that got trapped, something that's not from this world and that's still waiting. Years later, I learned more about the history of that complex. It wasn't just an abandoned construction project. It had been built over an old mining camp from the 1800s, where cave-ins had killed dozens of workers. The developers had tried to keep that quiet, but local historians knew. They said the ground was unstable, not just physically, but spiritually. Too many people had died there in fear and darkness, and their terror had soaked into the earth itself. The couple who'd been found in the cistern. The official report was inconclusive, but one of the responding officers eventually spoke off the record. He said they'd been arranged in a pattern, surrounded by symbols carved into the concrete walls. Symbols that matched the ones we'd seen that night. Sometimes I drive past that area, and I can see the buildings in the distance, still standing, still waiting. I wonder how many other groups of teenagers have wandered in there over the years, and how many made it out. The worst part is knowing that whatever we encountered that night is still there, patient and hungry, gathering strength in the darkness between those concrete walls. And I can't shake the feeling that someday it won't be content to just wait anymore. I never could stand working for that shipping company. Every single day, they'd scream at me for not meeting expectations that were completely unrealistic. In the end, they fired me because I didn't complete one of the routes they'd assigned me. But let me tell you why I couldn't finish it. And believe me, saying I had a good reason would be an understatement. What did my boss expect me to do? Just leave that girl behind? Let me start from the beginning. It all began like any normal day. Before the sun even peeked over the horizon, I was already getting up to make my coffee. I prepared a huge 34-ounce cup and hit the road. I'm not really a morning person, but one of the few perks of that job was watching the sunrise. That particular morning, the sky was painted an intense pink with clouds that looked like they'd been brushed with streaks of yellow. It was quite a sight, I have to admit. When I arrived at the warehouse, they informed me I'd have to cover another route in addition to my own, which, by the way, was already the longest and most boring of them all. I wasn't thrilled, but at that company, they didn't ask if you wanted to do something. They just told you that you had to do it, period. They did pay for the extra work though, and I needed the money, so I accepted it without complaint, even with a smile. The double route was going to take me deep into the Louisiana bayou. And believe me, rural routes are the worst because you spend hours driving between houses that seem to go on forever, with very few stops. But I didn't complain too much. The routine was more or less like this. I'd pick up all the packages for both routes, organize everything properly, and get going. My regular route took about 7 hours and wasn't really anything special, just suburban neighborhoods, so everything was fairly predictable and calm. Dogs barking, doors you sometimes had to hunt for, and some cats that would come out to greet you. At one of those stops, just as I was heading out, an orange cat appeared and approached me as if it wanted to say hello. But of course, that wasn't the weird part, just something I wanted to mention. When I finished the first route and prepared to start the second one, I realized the first stop was about 45 minutes away. And that's when I thought, okay, here we go. Rural routes often have more packages than urban ones but fewer stops, so the time evens out, it just passes much more slowly. Everything was going normally, nothing strange, until I reached this old shack. Or rather, this cabin that looked like it was about to sink into the swamp, almost as if the earth itself was swallowing it. It sat right at the water's edge, hidden among enormous green trees. What was odd was that throughout that entire route, this stop had way more packages than the others. I had to leave 14 boxes there in total, the most I'd ever delivered to a single location in my entire career. I started unloading and leaving the boxes by the front door, everything normal until on my second trip. When I opened the main door, it creaked horribly. Just as I was standing up, an old man appeared with a disheveled face, hair that seemed to be escaping from his head, and clothes that looked like they'd been chewed by a cow before he put them on. He was one of those guys who looked like he hadn't shaved in months, wearing a dirty tank top and very short shorts. His thighs were so white they reflected sunlight. It almost hurt to look at them, but that clearly wasn't the most disturbing thing. When the old man saw me, he let out a kind of dry laugh and said, "Are all my packages here?" In a raspy voice like he'd smoked 1,000 packs of cigarettes in his lifetime. I told him yes, that I was just a delivery driver and had more packages to deliver, that I'd bring him the rest and be on my way immediately. But at that moment, he started pulling out a knife and opening some boxes I'd left there. Without saying anything, I continued unloading packages, making 2 more trips for him. Just when I thought everything would be ready, the old man suddenly shouted, "Don't move. You're not going anywhere until I confirm I have everything here." I had several more packages to deliver, but I didn't want trouble with this guy. He seemed pretty hostile, so I preferred to wait a bit longer while he checked his boxes. So I nodded, somewhat scared, but with no other choice. While he tore open the boxes, I stood there looking at the interior of his house. It was an old structure and looked pretty messy, but there was something that immediately caught my attention. A door in the back, locked with chains and a huge padlock, hidden behind a round table. I stared at it fixedly, wondering what he might have in there. After all, a door locked from the outside is always suspicious. The old man started muttering things to himself, as if he was angry with someone, saying, "They think they can steal from me. I'll show them." That snapped me out of my thoughts, so I asked him, "Who robbed you?" He looked up but didn't say anything, just kept opening boxes. Then I dared to ask, "Hey, does anyone else live here with you? A wife or something?" After saying that, he turned around, approached me with a serious face, and said, "That's none of your business." "Hey, don't get upset. I was just making conversation. You're keeping me here, so I'm getting bored," I told him. But I still didn't like anything about that locked door. What could he be keeping in there? Obviously, it was something important, or maybe someone. An idea occurred to me at that moment. I told him I just wanted to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything in the truck and would go check for a few seconds. He reluctantly agreed and let me go back. When I got there, I hid behind the cargo area and looked around. I wanted to investigate, but I knew that to do it, I had to act quickly and stealthily, taking advantage of the fact that the guy was too focused checking his merchandise. Before moving, I carefully looked around the house for a possible second entrance, but there wasn't one, just a small side window without curtains. The first thing I noticed was all the mess and garbage throughout the house. It seemed like the guy was a compulsive hoarder because there were piles of things everywhere. The truth is, it was disgusting. Flies danced in every corner. The kitchen wasn't very visible, just a huge pile of dishes stacked in a corner. But when I moved a little closer, I looked at what must be the locked room, which had newspaper on the windows. However, I found a small hole in the wall that served for me to see inside without him seeing me. But what I saw gave me chills. There was a young woman, clearly pregnant, no more than 20 years old. Her hair was very long and tangled. You could tell it had been years since she'd cut or properly groomed it. She was on an old little bed on the floor, surrounded by huge piles of books, all quite worn as if she'd read them over and over again. When she saw me, I couldn't help but let out a muffled groan from the shock. This made the girl notice me. She saw me through the hole and was startled. She held her abdomen and gestured for silence, as if asking for help without saying a word. I was stunned, my head spinning and heart about to explode. I couldn't believe it. That disgusting old man had this girl captive, and my first thought was that he was the father of the baby, though it was too early to draw conclusions. Before I could think much more, I slowly retreated and returned to the truck. I looked again at the old man, who now had his phone in hand checking something. I tried calling the police, but had no signal, so I was stuck in that limbo, not knowing what to do, anguished about the girl and the situation. I wondered if he'd ever been in trouble with the law for this, if the girl was really a prisoner, or was his daughter or granddaughter, or if she was just someone who, for some reason, couldn't leave. The truth seemed to be that she'd been trapped in that house for years, and something in me said my first hypothesis was correct, that this creepy old man had kidnapped this girl and was evading justice. I didn't have an easy way to open the padlock with what I had in the van, but then I had an idea. I calmly asked the old man if I could use his bathroom because I needed a break, a moment to breathe. He looked me up and down, then looked at his house, and finally reluctantly agreed, saying, "Okay, follow me. But don't take long." I thanked him and went in, feeling adrenaline coursing through me for what I was about to do. The house was total chaos, much worse than it looked from outside, with piles of garbage in every corner and narrow hallways where I could barely move. We reached the bathroom, and once there, the old man gestured for me to enter, and I had to pass right by him to get in. The bathroom seriously looked like it had never been cleaned. The toilet was dark brown, almost black, and there wasn't much space to do anything. I was thinking about how I could break the padlock, but also the old man didn't leave the door. I could see his shadow waiting outside, so I urinated quickly to avoid raising suspicions. I started looking around for something that would serve as a tool to open the door or to use against the guy, but I didn't find anything. The heaviest thing I saw was the toilet tank lid, which was porcelain, so I removed it and then opened the door. The man tried to say something, but before he could try anything, I smashed the toilet lid over his head. The lid shattered, and the old man fell to the floor unconscious. Immediately I jumped over him, and in my rush toward the locked room, I found an axe in a corner. I quickly grabbed it and started breaking down the door, shouting instructions to the girl, telling her to get away, that I was going to break the padlock. The first blow missed, and at that moment I heard his labored breathing behind the door. But I didn't give up. I kept hitting until I finally managed to blow off the padlock and remove the chains. She was crying, clearly scared, and I extended my hand to help her out. While she was coming out, the man started getting up and shouting, "What the hell are you doing? Who do you think you are? You can't leave," he screamed. But the girl didn't pay attention to him and ran toward the truck with me. It was difficult for us to move quickly because of her condition, but we managed to get there before he could fully get up. I helped her get in and put on her seatbelt. Then I backed up the truck and we sped out of there, quickly arriving at the nearest police station. Once there, she started telling me that she didn't remember how long she'd been in that house, that the man was her biological father, whom she decided to look for when she was 17, since she'd never known him and her mother wouldn't let her see him. This revelation turned my stomach and made my hair stand on end. She said he'd locked her in there since then, and all that time she'd been his prisoner. The girl mentioned the horrible things he did to her, and just as I suspected, she was pregnant by him. All this seemed so macabre and repulsive that it made my blood boil. I felt like going back and tearing that disgusting old man's eyes out. She revealed that she was in her second pregnancy, and that the first had ended in miscarriage. That made the guy even more furious, and he refused to give her food for days. The police went to look for him, and to our surprise, they found that the guy had committed suicide. He'd shot himself in the head. Maybe that was his best luck. I felt powerless knowing he'd escaped justice, but at least he could never hurt anyone else again. When I returned to the warehouse, my boss was furious because I hadn't made all the corresponding deliveries. I tried to explain the situation, thinking he'd understand my reasons. But to my amazement, he told me I should have called him so they could send a substitute to pick up the rest of the packages and deliver them properly. And that's why they fired me. It sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly how it happened. For a moment, I thought they'd give me recognition for rescuing a kidnapped person, but instead, they threw me out of the company like a dog, and I spent months unemployed before getting a new job at a warehouse. However, I feel at peace. Who cares if I lost my job? I rescued an innocent person from the clutches of a monster, and that's more valuable than anything else to me. Good evening. I've been following your work for a while now, and tonight I finally decided to write to you. What I'm about to tell you isn't easy because it touches wounds that we spend our lives trying to keep closed, pretending they're not there. My name is Robert, and this story happened several years ago, but the weight of it that I carry to this day. I grew up in what you might call a complicated family. It wasn't about lack of money or illness or anything you could point to and say, that's the problem. It was something in the air, a bitterness that passed from one person to another like the flu, you know. My father, my uncles, my older cousins lived constantly needling each other over inheritance of land that didn't even exist anymore, rehashing petty arguments from parties 20 years past. If someone managed to take a step forward, even if they bought a used motorcycle on credit, the crew in the back would already form a circle to say it wouldn't work out, that it was a waste of time, that they'd soon be drowning in debt. It was as if failure was a family tradition, and woe to anyone who tried to break it. Since I was a kid, I felt that wasn't for me. I watched quietly and thought it couldn't be possible that life was just this. I fled that environment as soon as I felt man enough to do it. I went to live in a boarding house downtown, a very simple place, and started working odd jobs as a construction laborer. I carried many buckets of cement. I learned the trade the hard way. It was during that time, grinding from sunrise to sunset, that I met Clara, my wife. She was the complete opposite of everything I knew in my family. She had a calmness, a faith in people, and in the future that was almost unsettling to me. The two of us worked like crazy for almost a decade. I had already become a skilled worker, taking on some renovation jobs on my own. She cleaned houses, took care of elderly people, whatever came up. Every penny was saved. Our big dream even had a name. Our corner, our little market. We bought a small lot in one of those simpler, more remote residential neighborhoods, with some houses on one side and lots of woods on the other. For a whole year, every weekend and every night, I raised the walls of our little house in the back and in the front, the hall of our grocery store. Every brick there has our sweat in it. The day we finally opened, I'll never forget it. It was a small room, metal shelves that we bought second-hand and painted light blue, a wooden counter that I sanded and varnished myself. There was a smell of fresh paint mixed with the smell of bread we had ordered. Clara, in her way, lit a little candle to Saint Benedict in a corner on a high shelf and said a prayer quietly. For us, that place wasn't just a business. It was proof that we could indeed break that tradition. It was our sanctuary, the place where bitterness couldn't enter. In the beginning, everything was wonderful. The neighborhood folks started showing up, an elderly lady here, some kids buying soda and snacks there. The traffic was small, but it was ours. It was steady. Clara stayed at the register in the morning, and I took over in the late afternoon when I got back from construction sites, because I continued taking jobs to guarantee income and not drain the store. We'd get to the end of the day exhausted, but with a good feeling, you know. On purpose, our sanctuary was working. But no sanctuary is immune to the outside world, right? And my world of origin, my family, didn't take long to knock on the door. One Saturday afternoon, my parents showed up. They lived on a more remote farm. It wasn't common for them to come down to the city in the middle of the week, much less without warning. They arrived, parked the old pickup truck in front, and came in. They looked at everything with serious faces, an air of inspection. My mother ran her finger along a shelf, as if looking for dust, and my father stood in the middle of the store with his arms crossed. "So this is it," my father finally said, with a tone that wasn't a question, it was a statement. A somewhat disappointed statement. "Yes, Dad, it's our corner," I replied, trying to keep my voice firm. The pride of showing what we had built. The conversation that followed was a bucket of cold water. That this was a risky business. That a small store like this, the first crisis would take away. That I should have stayed quiet just with my profession as a construction worker, which was more guaranteed. I listened to everything without responding, just nodding my head. I already knew that record. It was the official anthem of my family. Clara, beside the register, just watched quietly, and I saw her hand squeezing a cloth for cleaning the counter. Before they left, the blow came. My mother went to the shelves and picked up a bag of rice, a liter of oil, sugar, a package of coffee. The basic of basics. "Robert, write this down for us, son. Next week we'll come down again and settle up with you," she said, already walking toward the door as if it were the most natural and guaranteed thing in the world. I felt a knot in my stomach. Credit, the word that gives chills to any small business owner. Clara's family sometimes asked, but it was completely different. Her mother would come, take what she needed, and in 2 days at most she'd be there with money in hand and still bring some mangoes or bananas from her yard as a treat. It was a relationship of respect. With my parents, well, I didn't have that same security, but what was I going to do? Deny my own mother there in front of my wife? I wrote it down in a little notebook with a tightness in my chest. The week passed, turned into another, and nothing, not even a phone call. I tried not to think about it, but it kept eating at me. Until 15 days later, they showed up again. They arrived smiling as if nothing had happened, and my mother went straight to the shelf again. "Son, get me another package of cornmeal and some cans of sardines." I took a deep breath, had to speak. There was no way around it. I tried to sound as calm as I could manage. "Mom, the purchase from the other time is still open here in the notebook." Her face changed immediately. That smile disappeared, giving way to an offended, almost indignant expression. "You're doubting your own mother, Robert. Is that it? Put everything together on the account. When we come again, we'll pay for everything." The tone was dry, cutting. It put me in my place as an ungrateful son. I didn't have the courage to insist. I sold again. They left and left behind not only a bigger debt, but that rotten feeling in the air. The feeling that they had succeeded. They had found a crack in the wall of my sanctuary. And I knew it. I knew very well that this was just the beginning. The news or the gossip spread quickly in the family. If Robert's parents could buy on credit, why not the rest? First, it was an uncle, then a cousin, then a second cousin I hadn't seen since childhood. They'd arrive at the store friendly, pat me on the back, praise the place, buy a soda, pay for it. Then on the way out, "Oh, Robert, get me a pack of cigarettes. Write it down, I'll come by tomorrow and pay." And of course, they never came back. It was a constant test and provocation. That was consuming me from inside. It wasn't even so much about the lost money, it was about the affront, the lack of respect for our effort. But the last straw, the day everything soured for good, was on a Friday afternoon. I was at the register, and my son, Tommy, who was 5 at the time, was playing on the floor behind the counter with some toy cars. The door opened, and a cousin of mine came in. I smelled the liquor from far away. He came staggering with that smile of someone who's already drunk all there is and thinks he owns the world. He went straight to the beer cooler, grabbed about 4 bottles, and slammed them on the counter. The sound of glass hitting would made Tommy shrink back. "What's up, cousin? Put it on the account. The weekend looks promising," he said with a slurred voice. "No," I replied as firmly as I could without raising my tone. "Credit's over. We don't sell on credit to anyone anymore." He stopped and stared at me. First, he gave a little laugh as if it were a joke. When he saw that my face remained serious, his expression darkened. "What's this? Now you've become a rich guy. Think you're better than family because you have this shitty little store." "Leave," I said quietly, pointing with my head toward my son. "Tommy's here. I don't want trouble in front of him." That seemed to throw more alcohol on his fire. He slammed his hand on the counter hard. "Tommy, you worry about, but you don't worry about your family, about what my father already lent to yours, and you deny me a beer." He started yelling, cursing, gave a slap to a snack display that fell over, and scattered everything on the floor. The noise made my son start crying, a loud cry of pure fright. At that moment, something inside me exploded. I came out from behind the counter, grabbed him by the arm with a strength I didn't know I had, and dragged him outside the store. "Get lost. Don't ever set foot in my business in my house again. Get lost." He kept yelling things from the street, calling me every name in the book. But I slammed the metal door in his face. I stood there with my back to the door, trembling with rage, while Clara picked up our son to calm him down. That night the food wouldn't go down. I knew I had crossed a line. And as I expected, in less than 2 days I was the monster of the family. The version that reached everyone's ears was that I, the arrogant new rich guy, had humiliated and assaulted a poor cousin just because he asked me for help. Nobody mentioned that he was drunk, that he scared my son. That part of the story simply disappeared. The confirmation came when my parents showed up at the store a few days later. They didn't come to hear my side, they came to sentence me. "What got into you, Robert?" My mother began with a voice full of disappointment. "Attacking a relative, where have you ever seen such a thing? We didn't raise you to be like this." That's when I exploded. Raised me how? To bow my head to everything. To see a drunk relative scaring my son and stay quiet. Before you come talk about him, why don't you pay what you owe me? You don't mix things up. Family is family, my father retorted, raising his voice for the first time. "No," I shouted, banging my hand on my own counter. "Here, in this place, it's all the same thing. It's my work, it's my money, it's my family mine. the one I built with Clara. And I won't let your bitterness come in here and ruin everything. I said everything that had been choking me for years, that I left home to not be like them, that I never received help from anyone and didn't owe explanations to anyone. I said that from that day on, the rule was simple. Only those who came as customers entered my little market, relative, friend, whoever. If it wasn't to respect, they should stay away. They looked at me as if I were a complete stranger, a traitor. They left without saying another word. When the steel door came down making that sound of ending, a heavy silence remained in the store. I had finally said everything. I had erected a definitive wall, but I didn't feel relief. I felt an enormous emptiness. I had broken with my own blood. After that fight, a strange silence settled in. No relative of mine even passed by the store street. On one hand, it was a relief. The tension was over. We could work in peace. But on the other hand, that weighed on me. I'd get to night, lay my head on the pillow, and keep brooding. Had I not exaggerated? Wasn't there another way to solve it? Clara told me with all the patience in the world that I did what had to be done to protect our home. But doubt was eating at me. It was during this period of strange calm, about 2 weeks after the rupture, that things really began. And it wasn't anything flashy, no door slamming or shadows in the hallway. It was more subtle, more disgusting. It started with the rust. I had received a box of corn and pecans from a new supplier, first-rate product with long expiration dates. The next day, when I went to arrange them on the shelf, I noticed that several sealed cans had ugly orange stains, as if they had been sitting in the rain for years. I found it very strange. I separated the stained cans and thought, bad batch happens. I called the supplier, complained, and he very correctly exchanged everything without asking a question. But then the problem returned with sardine cans from another brand. Then, with the bottom of the brand new pressure cooker that Clara had bought for the house. And what made my hair stand on end was when I saw rust on the metal shelves of the little market themselves. I had painted all of them light blue, remember. The paint was impeccable. One Tuesday morning, I arrived to open the store, and one of the bottom shelves looked like it had aged about 30 years overnight. The paint was puffed up, peeling, and underneath, the metal was covered with that dark red powder, almost black. I ran my finger over it, and the powder stained my skin with a fine, oily texture like rotten velvet. Along with the rust came a smell. It was a smell that appeared mainly in the morning, as soon as we raised the steel door. It wasn't the smell of garbage or sewage or dead animal that we would at least know where it came from. It was a chemical smell, a mixture of sulfur like when you strike many matches in a closed place, with something rancid, old animal fat. It was a stench that entered the nose and seemed to stick in the throat, leaving a bitter taste in the mouth. We cleaned everything with bleach, with pine disinfectant, and the cleaning smell would dominate for a few hours. But the next day, there was the stench again, coming from nowhere. During this same time, I started having horrible nightmares. I can't remember the dreams themselves, just flashes of confused images. But I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my body drenched in sweat, my heart beating so hard it seemed like it would come out through my mouth, and a headache throbbing behind my eyes. I'd sit on the bed and stare into the darkness of the room, trying to understand that agony that had no name. I didn't tell Clara anything about this at first, not about the rust spreading or the nightmares. To me, in my head, it was all stress. The fight with the family, worry about money, guilt. My body was reacting. That was it. I repeated this to myself like a prayer. It's just stress. It's just tiredness. It'll pass soon. But deep down, a cold little voice told me it wasn't. It said that the air in our little market, our sanctuary, was getting heavy, dense, contaminated. As if the void my family left behind had been filled by something else. Something silent, patient, and very, very dirty. I couldn't keep it to myself for long. One night, after another nightmare that left me shaking in bed, I told Clara everything. I talked about the rust, the smell, the feeling of being watched inside our own store. She listened to me in silence, her face getting more and more serious with each word I said. When I finished, she didn't say I was crazy or anything like that. She took my hand and confessed that she also felt the heavy environment, that sometimes she had the impression of hearing someone moving in the store when there was no one there. From that day on, she doubled the prayers, started sprinkling holy water that she got from church in the corners, and lighting incense. We were scared, but at least now we were together in this. The first time I saw something was on a Thursday night. We had already closed. I went out to take the trash outside, and when I came back, I stopped in front of the glass door of the little market to be able to pull the steel door. The lights inside were on. I saw my reflection in the glass, normal, my usual tired face. But for a blink of an eye, a fraction of a second, my reflection changed. The face that stared at me from the other side of the glass opened a smile that wasn't mine. It was a wide, pulled smile that showed teeth and was full of hatred, pure contempt. The reflection's eyes seemed to darken, become empty. I took a step back. My heart jumped inside my chest. I blinked again, and the reflection returned to normal. It was just me again, with a scared face. I stood there, unable to move. Had it been a trick of light, fatigue playing a trick on me, or had I really seen that? After that day, I started feeling really sick, physically. A pain began at the base of my back, a deep pain that seemed to come from the bones. It went up the sides of my body and sometimes left me breathless. A low, persistent fever came that left me sweating cold during the day and with chills at night. I completely lost my appetite. The smell of Clara's food, which I had always loved, started making me nauseous. I went to the neighborhood health clinic. The doctor examined me, said it might be an infection, maybe in the kidneys, and prescribed a bunch of medicines that had no effect at all. I was wasting away before everyone's eyes, and while I got worse, the store seemed to get sick with me. The rust and smell were already part of the routine, but now the food started spoiling in an impossible way. We'd open a sealed jar of jam and find a thick layer of green mold on top. A factory-sealed package of cookies, and inside they were soft and covered with disgusting black spots. A customer came back to the store furious, saying that the can of peaches in syrup she bought here was full of white larvae. We went through an embarrassment I wouldn't wish on anyone. We were losing money, merchandise, and worst of all, customers and our credibility. The real terror, however, the confirmation that we weren't crazy, came on a Saturday afternoon. I was lying at home, ground down with pain, and Clara was doing a general cleaning in the little market. Suddenly I heard our house door slam shut with everything, and she came running in, white as paper, trembling from head to toe. "Robert, Robert," she stammered, barely able to form words. I sat up in bed, my whole body aching. scared by her state. "What happened, honey? For God's sake, what happened?" She grabbed onto me, crying with her face hidden in my shoulder. I saw you in the store." "What do you mean, Clara? I'm here lying down." She raised her face, and I saw the terror in her eyes. It was something I had never seen in anyone. No, it wasn't you. I was with my back turned, cleaning the bottom shelf. I felt a chill on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. When I looked back, there was someone on the floor crawling toward me, coming from the back of the store. She took a deep breath, sobbing. "It was you, Robert, your body, your work clothes." But it was crawling like an animal, all twisted. The arms seemed longer, and the face was covered by something black. A dark, thick mud that was dripping and falling on the floor and making a noise. A wet throat noise, like it was drowning in the dry. At that moment, while she described that disgusting scene to me, I felt a cold that wasn't from fever. There was no more room for doubt, for thinking it was stress or imagination. The thing that was in our store, that was rotting our dream, was now using my face and was trying to get close to my wife. After what Clara saw, fear settled in our house for good. It was no longer a suspicion, a feeling, it was a certainty. There was something in there, inside that store, and it wasn't friendly. We barely slept. Any creak in the house would make us jump. One night, Tommy woke up crying and asked Clara who the dirty man was who kept looking at him from the corner of the store. At that moment, fear turned into panic. Clara wouldn't enter the little market alone anymore, no way. And I, even with the pain in my body and weakness consuming me, accompanied her. But I confess that every step inside that place was a sacrifice. The little market that used to be our pride had become enemy territory. Customer traffic had already dropped to almost nothing. The few people who still came in seemed to feel the charged environment. They bought what they needed quickly, head down, and left without much conversation. We seriously thought about closing, selling everything for whatever price they'd give, and disappearing from there. But go where? Do what? Everything we had, every penny saved in 10 years of hard work, was invested in those walls, those shelves. We were trapped in our own nightmare. We thought things couldn't get worse. We were very wrong. One Monday morning, we woke up after a terrible night. Clara said she had a horrible nightmare with the sound of glass breaking, a sound that wouldn't stop. I tried to say it was just a bad dream, but she was restless. We went to open the store as always, a ritual that was now full of dread. I unlocked the big padlock on the steel door and raised the metal sheet with my whole body aching. And we both stopped, frozen in the doorway. The store was destroyed. There's no other word, destroyed. It looked like a hurricane had passed through there, but only in there. Heavy metal shelves that I myself had screwed to the wall were turned upside down. Glass bottles of oil, vinegar, juice were shattered everywhere. The walls were stained, and the floor was a carpet of glass shards, scattered food, and sticky liquids. There was a 25-pound bag of wheat flour torn open, and the white powder was spread over everything like dirty snow. On top of the flour, someone or something had spilled bottles of soybean oil, forming a disgusting, slippery paste. Pasta packages had been opened and thrown everywhere. The smell was a sour mixture of vinegar with the sweetness of juice and the rancid oil. My first instinct, however absurd it may seem, was to think we'd been robbed. I ran, stumbling over things, to the cash register counter. The money drawer was there, intact. Not a single dollar had disappeared. I checked the windows, the back door that led to our house, everything locked from the inside, without any sign of break-in. The only entrance was the front steel door, and its padlock was in my pocket. The destruction had come from within. Clara put her hands to her mouth, her eyes full of tears, letting out a low sound of pure despair. I stood there in the middle of that chaos, that filth, looking at our dream, our work, our sweat, everything there crushed, violated on the floor. And that's when I broke down. I didn't scream, didn't curse, I just started crying. I crouched in the middle of the mess and cried like a child, a silent cry of pure helplessness. I cried from anger, from tiredness, from not understanding why. What had we done to deserve so much hatred? We just wanted to work in peace. Why did someone or something hate us so much as to do this? I felt Clara's hand on my shoulder. She had stopped crying. Her face, when I looked up, had a hard, determined expression, one I had never seen. Her shock had turned to anger too. She crouched in front of me, in the middle of the dirt, and made me look at her. "Robert, get up, stop crying. This here wasn't done by people. It wasn't your cousin, it wasn't thieves. This was something else. And to fight this thing, prayer and holy water aren't being enough. We're going to have to look for another kind of help." Now, Clara's mother, my mother-in-law, had always been a very sensible woman of great faith. When Clara called her crying and roughly told her what had happened, she didn't doubt for a second. She came to our house the same day. She looked at the state of the store, looked at my face, pale and about 10 pounds thinner, and pronounced with a firm voice, "My daughter, there's evil done here. And it's not evil from common people. It was she who gave us a path. She said she knew a man, a spiritual healer who lived in an older neighborhood on the other side of town. A serious man who didn't charge anything for what he did, and who had already helped many people in her family with problems that doctors don't find and priests don't solve. At that point, I would accept help from anyone to get that thing out of our lives." I just nodded yes, feeling a drop of hope for the first time in months. The next day, all three of us went. The man's house was simple, an old 2-story house with a low iron gate painted green. The only thing that caught attention was the strong smell of herbs, fresh plants that came from the backyard. He received us in the living room. He was a man of about 70, maybe more, with white hair and a very calm look, a look that seemed to see through us. We started telling the story, Clara nervous, talking about the figure she saw, me with a weak voice talking about the rust, the smell, my illness. But after a few minutes, he raised his hand asking for silence. He stared at me for a while, a whole minute maybe, without blinking. It was uncomfortable. Then he sighed, a heavy sigh as if he carried the weight of the world. "You don't need to tell me anything more, my son. I'm seeing what's hanging on you." Clara and I looked at each other, and I felt a strong chill even with the fever. "What are you seeing?" she asked with a trembling voice. "What you have at home isn't a haunting, isn't a wandering soul," he said with a low, grave voice. "It's an attachment, a bad thing without light that feeds on negative energy. And this thing was attracted to your lives." He paused as if choosing his words carefully. "Someone in your family, Robert, wishes you very ill. It's not just envy of your business. It's a deep hatred, a desire to see you destroyed, to pull you back to the same pit of bitterness they live in. That hatred, that twisted prayer they made against you, opened a door, and this thing entered through it." I felt a knot form in my stomach. It was confirmation of everything I already knew deep down. This thing, the healer continued, leaning forward a little, is a parasite. It wants what's yours. It started corroding your dream, your store, which is the symbol of your strength. Then it started imitating you, using your image, because its goal is to take your place in your family. And it's weakening you, making you sick for a very specific reason. He looked deep into my eyes, and then into Clara's with a seriousness that chilled. The final target isn't you, Robert. The final target is the child. Their energy is clean, pure. And this thing wants to get close to them. If it hasn't succeeded yet, it's because of your wife's faith, the protection she puts around the children, even without knowing it. But the attachment is patient. It's waiting for you to weaken completely to strike. Hearing that was like taking a punch to the face. The image of my children passed through my head. The anger I felt at that moment was so great it swallowed the fear. The man calmed us down, said there was a way, but that we needed to be strong and do our part. He gave us a bundle of herbs tied with string. He said it had guinea grass, rue, and other protective leaves, and a small black cloth bag with coarse salt and charcoal inside for each room of the house and store. He gave precise instructions. We had to do a heavy cleaning of everything, burn the herbs in all corners, and put the little bags behind the doors. And most importantly, he said he would be praying for us for the next 7 days to give us strength. But the biggest work is yours, he said as he walked us to the door. Faith drives away evil, but we also have to lock the lock through which it entered. We left there in silence. I was driving, but my head was miles away. Now the enemy had a name, and I knew exactly what lock I needed to lock once and for all. We returned home with a different energy. The fear was still there deep down, but now it had a companion, determination. We didn't wait for the next day. We started the cleaning that same afternoon. It was 2 full days of work. My mother-in-law, an angel in our lives, stayed with the children at her house to leave us in peace. Clara and I put on old clothes and entered the war. We threw away almost half of our stock. All the cans, all the packages that seemed suspicious, everything went into reinforced garbage bags. The metal shelves that were most affected by rust, I dismantled and threw in the dumpster. I didn't want any trace of that rot there. We washed the floor and walls with buckets of a mixture of water and coarse salt, as the man had instructed. The store was almost empty. It seemed like we were starting from scratch again. After the physical cleaning came the spiritual. At dusk on the 2nd day, we closed everything and Clara began burning the bundle of herbs in a clay saucer. The smoke that rose was dense, white, and had a strong smell. But it wasn't a bad smell. It was a smell of herbs, of real cleaning. She went through every corner of the store and then our house, praying the prayers the healer taught with a firm voice. I followed behind in silence, hanging the salt and charcoal bags behind each door. While the smoke filled the air, we heard a single sharp crack coming from the back of the store, like something glass breaking under invisible pressure, followed by a wave of cold that passed through us and dissipated in the air. Soon after, I felt something strange. The pain in my back, that deep pain that had accompanied me for weeks, began to diminish. It seemed like an invisible weight was being lifted from my shoulders. That night, for the first time in a very, very long time, I slept through the night without nightmares. The next day, the fever had finally gone away. Gradually, life returned to normal, or rather to new normal. The store, now clean and half empty, no longer seemed so heavy. The air was lighter, We restocked carefully, buying little, just the essentials. Some old customers, seeing that we were still standing, came back. New ones appeared. It was a slow, difficult restart, but it was truly ours. And I did what needed to be done. I locked the lock. I stopped answering phone calls, didn't respond to messages anymore. I cut contact with uncles, cousins, everyone from that side of the family. It wasn't a fight, it wasn't an announcement, it was silence, a definitive separation. With my parents, the relationship changed completely. I visit them occasionally at their farm on dates like Christmas or their birthdays. I talk about the weather, about the harvest, but I don't talk about my life, my children, my business. And they don't enter my house anymore. The door of my sanctuary closed to them forever. They never asked why. I think deep down they know. I can't say exactly who in my family wished me such ill, whether it was my parents, my cousin, an aunt, or all of them together. And to be honest, I chose not to want to know. It wouldn't make a difference. What matters is that their hatred, the envy, was strong enough to open a door and almost destroy us. Today we live in peace, a peace that cost very dearly. Sometimes on the street I run into some relative. They turn their face or look at me with cold anger. I just lower my head and move forward. I feel a pang of sadness. Of course, it's my blood after all. But then I get home, open the door, and see Clara and my children laughing in the living room. I smell dinner on the stove, and I know with every fiber of my being that I made the right choice. I sacrificed a part of my history to save what I hold most precious. And I would do it all again without even blinking. I have a story that I'll accompany by sharing a photo, though I should mention that this experience, brief as it was to witness, brought my father and me closer together that night during my early teenage years. When I was 13, my parents and I lived in Millfield, a small community in rural Ohio, where our house was one of the last on the street, heading up the hill. I had an aunt who neither my father nor I got along with very well, because she was a gossipy, malicious person who seemed to thrive on causing trouble within the family. One day, out of nowhere, she gave my mother some candy and chocolates. These came with a small puppet, a little clown figure. This clown had small red shoes, black and white checkered overalls, and underneath the overalls, a white long-sleeved shirt with colorful polka dots. The clown's face was white, and its expression was peculiar, unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. Unlike the photo I could show you, my mother's clown didn't have any kind of hat or cap. It was maybe 8 to 12 inches tall at most. A few days after my aunt gave it to her, my dad started telling Mom that the puppet was moving around the house. I would overhear them talking about this, and Mom would tell him how ridiculous that sounded, that it was a gift from my aunt, after all. But Dad insisted, saying he frequently found it in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the living room, under beds, even though Mom always left it on a shelf in the hallway. Mom would say that surely I was the one moving it around and leaving it in different places. I never touched that thing. I didn't see it in other locations either, and I didn't think Dad would lie about something like that. But it became a recurring argument between them. Dad kept asking Mom to let him throw it away, or at least put it away somewhere, saying that my aunt would never notice, since she rarely visited our house anyway. He insisted that the clown kept appearing throughout the house, and that my aunt had done something to it deliberately. but Mom always refused, saying she never saw it anywhere other than its designated spot. Then one night, it was a Saturday when Mom had gone to visit my grandmother, Dad and I were sitting in rocking chairs on our front porch. To give you an idea of how isolated we were up there, our nearest neighbor was about 50 to 60 feet away, which left our block pretty much deserted. As I mentioned, we were among the houses highest up the hill. While we were talking, both of us saw that little clown puppet come running out of our front door. It ran straight into the brush and woods that covered the vacant lot in front of our house, which sloped down into more empty lots below. We both stopped rocking and sat there paralyzed, staring at the woods because we could no longer see the puppet. However, we could definitely hear it moving through the undergrowth. The first thing I asked Dad was, "Nobody's going to believe this, are they?" "No, son, especially not your mother. Come on, let's get inside." I was terrified, and I knew Dad was too, maybe because this confirmed what he'd been telling Mom all along. But he acted so calm about it, which helped settle me down a bit. Still, it was absolutely horrible to see a puppet run out of our house by itself like that. The fact that Dad saw it too opened my eyes to this whole world of the paranormal. It was my first real encounter with something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as imagination. Looking back, I have to wonder about the intentions behind my aunt's gift. Was it an accident, mere coincidence, or was it given with a specific purpose in mind? Given my aunt's malicious nature and the trouble she liked to cause in our family, I can't help but suspect there was something more sinister behind that innocent-looking puppet. The memory of watching that clown run into the darkness, and the sound of it crashing through the brush long after it disappeared from sight, still gives me chills. Whatever my aunt's intentions were, that puppet brought something dark into our home, something that Dad had been aware of long before that terrifying night, when we both witnessed its true nature. I was born and raised in a small town in Virginia, just a few miles from Washington, D.C. This used to be a very quiet place where most of my neighbors were older people who moved there to spend their retirement years. That's why there weren't too many kids to play with. In fact, I was the only child living on my street, so you can imagine how much I loved being at school. However, my luck changed when I was 8 years old, the day the Lopez family moved into the house next door, a couple of Mexican origin with 2 children, Fabio, who was 8 years old, and Marcela, who was 7. From the first day they arrived, these kids became my best friends. Every afternoon we'd go out to play for hours, and often my mom would bake cookies and serve them to us with milk at the end of the afternoon before they returned home. However, it seemed that things in the Lopez household weren't going well at all. Mr. Ernesto, the children's father, was a very bad-tempered, violent man with apparent alcohol problems, who was frequently heard yelling at them and their mother. The arguments were constant, and on many occasions you could hear blows and crying. But there was one particular occasion that was very frightening. On one of those many nights when Mr. Lopez came home drunk and the fights began, we heard a shotgun blast followed by a lot of screaming. This made my parents and other neighbors, fearing the worst, approach the house to find out what had happened. After knocking on the door insistently, they finally opened it, and Mrs. Marta peeked her face through it, but without opening it completely. According to my parents, she seemed scared and her voice betrayed her nervousness. But when questioned by the neighbors about the origin of the gunshot, she quickly began to explain that it had just been an accident, that her husband was trying to clean the weapon and it went off by mistake, but that it had only been a scare and everyone was fine. Logically, her story didn't convince anyone, so the neighbors asked her if she needed help and if she agreed to call the police. But she began shaking her head almost frantically and told them everything was fine. The next day, the children came out to play as usual, and we spent time riding bikes around the neighborhood. However, I could notice that Fabio had bruises on his arms, as did Marcella. So with the imprudence typical of 8-year-olds, I asked them directly if their father hit them. At that moment, both looked at each other almost alarmed and remained silent. But I didn't stop and told them that's what everyone thought. Upon hearing this, they stopped their bikes and told me they had to go home. At that moment, I wasn't able to understand their quick change of attitude. I told them it was barely mid-afternoon, and they just repeated that they had to go back and return to their house. I remember that day was Saturday, Mr. Lopez's favorite day of the week to go partying with his friends, and also one of the days when things got ugly in that house. However, that dawn there were no arguments or banging on the walls, which seemed strange but fortunate to us. The next day, the Lopez children didn't come out to play as usual. Their mother, who never left the house anyway, but later we found out what the reason was. And it's that apparently that Saturday, Mrs. Marta took advantage of her husband's absence to escape from that house with her 2 children and move to another city. I was very sad with the news because I knew I would never see my friends again. But at the same time, I felt relieved knowing they would no longer be mistreated by their father. After that event, Mr. Lopez's life took a very radical turn. The man began drinking heavily to the point of losing his job and wandering around the neighborhood drunk and smelly. He was practically homeless until a year later he took his own life in that house, something that surprised no one. After Mr. Lopez's death, the house remained uninhabited until 12 years later it was bought by a foundation to build a nursing home. But when they began excavations, they made a very macabre discovery. Buried in the backyard, they found the bodies of a woman and 2 children. It wasn't necessary to investigate much to know they were Mrs. Marta and her 2 children, my childhood friends. The discovery caused great commotion in the community, and later, a forensic analysis revealed that their necks had been cut, probably while they slept, since they were still wearing their pajamas. Now it was clear why there had been no noise that sinister night. Mrs. Marta and her children had never escaped that house. They had been murdered by that monster before they could ever leave, and he had spent an entire year living above their graves, drinking himself to death with the weight of what he had done. The thought that I might have been the last person to see my friends alive, that my innocent question about their father hitting them might have somehow contributed to what happened that night, haunts me to this day. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if the neighbors had called the police that night when they heard the gunshot, or if someone had been more persistent in checking on the family's welfare. But I was just a child then, and even the adults in our neighborhood couldn't have imagined the true horror that was happening right next door. The nursing home was never built. The property was eventually sold to the city and turned into a small memorial park. Sometimes I drive by there and think about Fabio and Marcella, wondering what kind of lives they might have had, what dreams they might have achieved if they had been given the chance to grow up. Their father took not only their lives, but also their futures, and for that, I'm glad he's no longer in this world. Some people don't deserve the air they breathe, and Ernesto Lopez was definitely one of them. Everything I'm about to tell you has my grandfather Henry and my grandmother Emily as the main characters. Since they're no longer with us, I feel I can share this story that honestly left me shocked. It's one of those things that after so much time, I still can't stop thinking about, and that seemed too real, too intense to be just a legend. I feel I have the right to tell it. First, because I'm a direct relative, and second, because it's one of those stories that changes your perspective on life a little, you know. My grandfather Henry grew up during a very hard time during the Great Depression in a very poor little town in Kansas. And I'm telling you this just like my mom told it to me. They didn't have a stale piece of bread to gnaw on. They looked for food anywhere they could, and sometimes that was just dandelion leaf salad. Literally, they only ate boiled eggs and dandelions. And they were pretty thin, both from the poor diet and from running around all day, being on the street with nothing, looking for anything to put in their mouths. The situation was so tough that you could say they were at the limit of extreme poverty. To give you an idea, my grandfather and my grandmother, who at that time were about 12 and 8 years old, lived in a world with almost no entertainment. There was nothing, so they made do with pieces of old cloth that they turned into toys, into something that for them was almost a party. Childhood wasn't like ours, full of games and technology. No, they were used to monotony, effort, having nothing, and having to work from a very young age. Poverty had marked them deeply. But what I'll never forget is how excited they got when they found out that somewhere in town a carnival was coming. A carnival, can you imagine? Games, rides, fairs, music, everything. Except their parents didn't have money to pay for everyone. They could only give them money for 2 tickets and a little fare money. So with barely 50 cents between the two of them, they headed out to where the attractions had been set up. The joy of that day was incredible. The feeling of freedom, of being able to go and do whatever they wanted, was something they didn't feel every day, and they took it calmly. They enjoyed every game, every candy, every moment. The games cost about 5 cents, and cinnamon wheels cost 2 cents each, so sometimes they allowed themselves to play more than once. For them, that afternoon seemed infinite, but as always happens in these stories, night began to fall much faster than they thought. And suddenly Henry started to worry when he saw that he no longer saw Emily by his side. He started looking for her everywhere. The sun was barely shining, and panic began to take hold of him. He searched for her among the crowd, asked neighbors he knew, and they all told him no, that they hadn't seen her. Until one of the neighbors, who was also from the street, told him that he had seen Emily walking hand in hand with an adult, and that she seemed very sad, crying almost nonstop. Henry froze with that information. He explained that their father wasn't with them, that they were alone. The man immediately started acting, worried too, and together they went out to look for Emily. But at that moment, there was no sign of her, just that horrible feeling in the chest that something was very wrong. And just when they were almost desperate, they heard weak crying coming from one of the carnival staff trucks. The door was slightly ajar, and when they tried to open it, they couldn't. At first, the neighbor started pounding on it furiously. And just then, someone opened the door with the face of having done the worst thing in his life, as if he had been caught in the act. And there, in that place, they saw Emily, who was crying inconsolably, as if something terrible had been done to her, and that broke their hearts. The neighbor, horrified, rushed Henry and Emily to get them out of there. He took them all in his car to the house and told the parents what had happened. The truth is, Henry didn't really understand what had happened to his sister, but he knew something was wrong. Emily didn't want to talk. She withdrew into herself and only cried in silence. That left them devastated, but his father, furious and hurt, went out with the neighbor in search of justice. My grandfather always said that night was chaos. People at the carnival started fighting, pulling out weapons and shooting. Rumors say that in those days people were very different, that they faced problems differently, as if they had a kind of justice of their own. The fact is that my grandfather's father got his revenge, but in a brutal way, since he killed the guy with machete blows, although he received 2 gunshots. It was a horrible thing. But being honest, deep down I'm glad he got justice for his daughter and that monster died. On the other hand, I think it was also much easier for them to handle all that trauma because many had suffered, and in a way were used to that kind of violence and constant danger. But that story, the one about the day everything got out of control, what happened to my grandfather and his sister, that's never forgotten. It's as if it were from another time, from another country, because nowadays in the United States things aren't exactly the same. There's a certain peace, a certain security that didn't exist then, and that partly makes me feel fortunate, because that story, that experience so hard, reminds me how much I have, and how much we should value what we have. It's a reminder that sometimes life can change in a second, and that justice and violence often walk hand in hand in the darkest moments. Being good kids, they decided they'd sneak away from work for a little while, and while their parents tried to get some money, they'd go alone to the carnival. The night they escaped was like their Christmas. It seemed like they'd been given the best gift in the world, but there was one condition. Henry, the oldest, my grandfather, couldn't stray far from his sister Emily, who was about 8 at the time. So, I want to tell you about the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me on the road. And the most important part is that I wasn't the only one who saw it. We were coming back from my cousin's wedding, my mom, dad, younger brother Jake, and me. The reception had been in this small town about 2 hours from our house in New Mexico, and it was probably 12:30 in the morning by the time we hit the road. I was in the back seat with Jake, talking with my mom about how beautiful the ceremony had been, how good the food was, and how much fun we'd all had dancing. My dad was behind the wheel, focused on the road ahead. We'd taken the old Route 66 that connects back to our part of town. It's not the fastest route, but it's scenic during the day and usually pretty quiet at night. We were maybe 20 minutes from home, cruising along at about 55 miles per hour, when something happened that I'll never forget as long as I live. My dad suddenly slammed on the brakes, and we all lurched forward in our seats. Right there in front of our headlights, something had sprinted across the entire width of the highway. It passed directly in front of our car, maybe 15 feet ahead of us, and what I saw still gives me nightmares. It looked like a person at first glance, but it definitely wasn't human. The thing was incredibly thin, skeletal almost, with pale, grayish skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. Its arms and legs were unnaturally long, so long that its fingertips were actually dragging along the asphalt as it ran. It wasn't very tall, maybe 5 feet 7 inches, but there was something completely wrong with the way it moved. It ran in this twisted, unnatural way, with its feet pointing backward and its arms swinging loosely like they were broken or didn't have any strength in them. The worst part was that while it was crossing the road, it kept its head turned toward us, staring directly at our car with these large, dark eyes that seemed to reflect our headlights. After it crossed the highway, it scrambled up a small hill on the far side and disappeared into the brush and rocks. My dad was so shaken that he almost lost control of the car. We swerved to the left and came dangerously close to going off the road into a deep ravine. Once we'd all caught our breath and my dad had pulled over to collect himself, we started talking about what we'd just seen. None of us could agree on exactly what it was. It definitely wasn't an animal. No animal moves like that or has those proportions. But it wasn't human either. It was something else entirely. Over time, we started to convince ourselves that maybe we'd been mistaken. You know how your mind works. You start to doubt what you saw, especially when it's something that shouldn't exist. Maybe we were all tired from the long day. Maybe the headlights had played tricks on us. Maybe it was just a person in strange clothes, or an injured animal we'd misidentified in the darkness. That explanation made sense, so we went with it. For about 2 years, we rarely talked about that night, and when we did, it was always with the understanding that we'd probably imagined the whole thing or blown it out of proportion. But then something happened that changed everything. Our close family friend Marcus came to our house one evening, and he was visibly shaken. He'd ridden his motorcycle over, and he was still trembling when he walked through our front door. He kept laughing, but it was that nervous kind of laughter people do when they're trying to convince themselves they're not going crazy. "You guys are never going to believe what I just saw," he said, pacing around our living room. "I was riding back from Albuquerque on Route 66, and I saw this thing, this creature, or whatever it was. It was thin as a rail, with these incredibly long arms that were dragging on the ground. And it was running across the road in this weird, twisted way." He described it perfectly. The pale skin, the backward-pointing feet, the way it moved like its joints were all wrong. And then he said the part that made my blood run cold. The creepiest part was that it stared right at me the whole time it was crossing, like it was studying me. When Marcus finished his description, our entire family just sat there in stunned silence. Because what he had just described, down to the smallest detail, was exactly what we had seen 2 years earlier. That's when I knew for certain that what we witnessed that night wasn't a trick of the light or a product of our tired minds. That thing, whatever it was, is real, and it's still out there. I don't know if it's some kind of undiscovered animal, or something supernatural, or maybe something even worse. All I know is that it exists, and it's roaming around Route 66 at night. And every time I drive that stretch of highway after dark, I find myself scanning the roadside, wondering if I'm going to see those long, dragging arms and those horrible, staring eyes again. A couple of years ago, I lived in a house with my two younger sisters and my dad, since our mother had passed away when my youngest sister was only 1 year old. That neighborhood wasn't the most dangerous place in the world, but it wasn't exactly somewhere you felt completely safe either. I remember some neighbors I'd seen in police reports when I was 5 years old. But this story isn't about that. The thing is, during the summer of 2018, my sisters and I used to stay outside until late, sometimes even after the sun had already set. I was 14 years old, and they were 11 and 9. My dad generally went to bed early because he had to get up early for work. To help you understand the story better, I need to describe what our house was like. It was a single-story building with 4 doors facing the street, but 3 of them opened to our bedroom area, and 1 led to my dad's room. The back part had also been affected by a recent storm, and we had 2 doors in the rear. 1 led to the kitchen and another to my dad's bedroom. That particular night, I was doing what I always did, listening to scary and creepy stories on my phone while drawing on my tablet. I never used headphones because I've always been paranoid about someone trying to break in or hearing strange noises. You know, habits of people who live in a sketchy area. My sisters were downstairs in their room doing their own things, and I wasn't worried about them at that moment. Dad was already in his bed sleeping. But you know, if something characterizes me, it's that I'm very aware of what's happening around me, and this makes me alert when I hear strange things. And that's precisely what happened. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang on the front door, not just one. There were about 4 knocks with full force, and they sounded several times. Each knock was brutal. It seemed like someone wanted to force their way in. I was shocked, hoping it wasn't what I thought it was. I looked at the time. It was exactly 1 in the morning. At that moment, I froze, breathing with fear, thinking that for some reason someone was there at the front door. Suddenly, my middle sister, whose name is Emma, came running to my room trying not to make noise, but with a face that showed she was terrified. She looked at me and with a trembling voice said, "You heard that too, right?" I just nodded with my heart racing. The idea that someone was outside at the door at that hour gave us chills. Without thinking, I told her we had to wake up Dad. I started walking with her toward his room while my younger sister, Lily, followed behind us. On that path, Lily also peeked out of her door for a moment with a panicked face and looked at us with wide-open eyes. I opened Dad's room door carefully. I approached him and whispered, "Dad, is there someone outside?" We heard knocking on the front door. When I said that, it almost made me nauseous. Dad jumped up, half annoyed, and shouted, "What are you saying? What's wrong?" I explained what we'd heard, that someone had been knocking hard that night. Immediately, Emma, my other sister, joined the scene with the same anxiety. I heard it too. Someone knocked on the door, she shouted with fear in her voice. My heart was beating like crazy, and in the middle of that fever of nerves, I watched as Dad slowly got up from bed and walked toward the living room window with all the calm he could muster, but with very attentive eyes. What happened next was that he checked outside, but didn't see anyone. He looked at us with a face like, "Are you kidding me?" and told us it was probably someone trying to scare us or some dog bothering around there. But despite that, I knew what we'd heard was real. It couldn't just be our imagination, much less a dog. At that moment, although my dad didn't believe us, I felt something very strange had happened. We could barely get back to bed, But that scare wouldn't leave me. That night, instead of sleeping, I lay down in my sister's room with a bat beside me and fear in my chest. My crazy mind started imagining that whoever was outside could do anything and would most likely break in at any moment. It was like a nightmare, but in real life. The next day, everything seemed normal. My sisters and I were in zombie mode, still with the scare in our heads. Dad, for his part, as always, tried to justify it by saying it was maybe a giant dog or a cat that hit the door, or that we'd simply fallen asleep and imagined things. That explanation didn't convince me at all. The night after that, around 11 o'clock, we heard another knock. But this time it was much stronger and more direct on the back door where Dad slept, right behind him. Dad screamed from the shock, and I started crying too, because this time I knew it couldn't just be a coincidence. It was something real. My sister stayed with me in the room trembling, and Dad slowly went out to check outside. When he approached the front door with a white face and shocked eyes, he realized that again there was no one there, but at least now he believed us. At that moment, we thought maybe it was someone who was just having fun bothering us, who would knock and run away because it didn't make sense. But no, that was just the beginning of everything strange. Dad, worried, decided to call the police. He said it was better to be safe because you never know. When they arrived, they talked to him and us and assured us they would patrol the neighborhood. That night, they checked our entire house and yard looking for any clue about who might be doing these things, but they found no one. Several weeks passed, and since that night the noises had stopped, so we had no idea who or what had been trying to get in or what they wanted exactly. But some time later, the police received another similar report, but a couple of houses down from ours. This time, the person doing it was arrested. They said it was a neighbor a couple of houses down, an older man, a former Marine who had become somewhat mentally unstable after his retirement. According to the news, this same guy had been linked to an attack before, and in that incident, 15 people were shot and killed in a nearby town. The truth is, that left me frozen when I found out. My dad confirmed that all of this was true, and from that day on, the story changed forever in my head. The police checked his house and all the evidence from that case, and thanks to that, they were able to confirm that it was indeed the man they were looking for. The good news is that Guy is now in prison and no longer lives in our neighborhood. But even though that's in the past, I still sometimes have nightmares about those nights. Sometimes I dream that he breaks in at night, destroys everything, and shoots my sisters and Dad. I even dream of scenarios that seem even worse. After that, my dad changed all the locks and reinforced the house's security. I suppose he was as shocked and worried as I was, knowing that such a dangerous person could have been trying to break into our house. The truth is, what scares me most is thinking about what could have happened if instead of just knocks that night, that man had actually broken in for real. I feel like we were very lucky. I hope that man gets what he deserves, or at least gets help if he's completely insane. I also want to believe that the families of that guy's victims can close that dark chapter knowing he can't hurt them anymore. I don't know if you'll believe me, or if what happened was something paranormal. The truth is, it's complicated to explain. 7 years ago, I was working in Detroit at an automotive parts factory. My shift ended at 11 at night. My neighbor also worked there, but we almost never coincided on shifts. That week, she was assigned the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. It was around 7 or 8 at night when she came to where I was working. She told me that the woman who was watching my kids had left just a few minutes after my husband went to work. I spoke with my supervisor to tell him I had to leave, and although it wasn't easy, he let me go. I ran home and got there in about 10 minutes. Upon arriving, I called my wife on the house phone and told her why I was there. Our girls were barely months old. I went out to the backyard to smoke a cigarette, and there was my neighbor washing clothes. I remember her name well, Sandra. "Wow, you got here fast," she said. I responded, confused, asking her to explain why she was asking me that. "Don't you remember? You came to see me at the factory to tell me that the woman left my kids alone." She looked at me without understanding anything and replied, "If you're going to smoke that, don't blame me." I apologized and told her I was nervous, but I thanked her. She insisted that she had never gone anywhere, that her shift didn't start until 11 at night. The next day I asked the guard, "Hey, what time did Sandra come in yesterday?" He replied that she came at her usual schedule. Then I asked him, "But just between us, did she come earlier to drop something off or report something?" He checked his logbook and said, "Look, here are your entry and exit times." I was left wondering what the hell had happened. I told my wife everything, and she decided to quit and return to our home in Ohio. I stayed one more month to finish paying off some things we owed to the family that had lent us money. I don't know if it was something paranormal. I asked to see the recordings, but they wouldn't let me. I never knew if I was alone or if there was someone who took Sandra's form. I also asked my coworkers if they saw anything strange that night when I had to leave in an emergency, but no one could tell me anything. The incident left me questioning everything I thought I knew about reality. How could someone who looked exactly like Sandra, who knew about my situation, who spoke with her voice and mannerisms, not actually be her? The factory was a secure building with cameras and guards. Yet somehow, something had walked in, delivered a message that turned out to be true, and vanished without a trace. What disturbed me most was the accuracy of the information. The babysitter had indeed left my children alone, exactly as this Sandra double had reported. It was as if whatever it was had been watching my house, monitoring my family's situation. In the weeks that followed, before I left Detroit, I found myself studying Sandra more carefully when we crossed paths. I looked for signs, inconsistencies, anything that might indicate she wasn't who she appeared to be. But she was always just Sandra, tired from her night shifts, complaining about the same things, living her predictable life. Sometimes I wonder if there are doubles of all of us walking around, stepping in when needed, knowing things they shouldn't know, appearing where they shouldn't be. And if so, how would we ever really know which version of the people around us is real? The question that haunts me most is this: if something could perfectly mimic Sandra to help me that night, what else might it be capable of? And more importantly, is it still watching my family, even now? My name is David, and I'm from a small town in northern Florida called Hastings. Back in 1999, I started working as a paramedic at a hospital in the northern area. There, I met a coworker from another nearby town. Since we were often assigned to work shifts together, we developed quite a bit of trust. I was attracted to her, and over time we started talking more personally. One day she asked me why I didn't come to her house after my shift. Taking advantage of the fact that I was free that day, I got off at 11 at night. I asked her if she had a partner, and she said no. My shift was from 3 in the afternoon to 11 at night. I left as usual and headed to her house, which was in the Riverside neighborhood of Jacksonville. Since GPS didn't exist on phones back then, she gave me directions, and I followed them as best I could. When I was about to enter Riverside from Highway 10, I noticed a large Baptist church that could be seen from the highway. Just as I was about to turn by the church, I saw a guy standing in front of the temple. He was dressed in a black shirt and cream-colored shorts. He was staring fixedly toward Highway 10, right where I had just entered. When I passed by him, I realized I couldn't see his face. I thought it was because of the darkness, but something seemed strange to me. I looked in the rearview mirror to see if he was moving. At that moment, the guy turned completely toward me and made a gesture, raising his shoulders and arms as if saying, "What are you looking at?" or "What's wrong?" The strange thing was that there was no way he could have known I was looking at him in the rearview mirror, because I had already passed by him. And until that moment, he was still staring at the highway. That gave me a terrible chill, and I accelerated until I reached my friend's house. When I arrived, she saw me pale. She asked what had happened to me. I didn't tell her what I saw in case she thought I was crazy. I told her I almost got hit on the way. We talked for a while, and in the conversation I asked her if she was divorced, to which she replied, "No, I'm a widow. My husband drowned at Devil's Den Spring. It's a natural formation that's well known by divers and for its natural beauty." But what froze my blood was what she told me next. It's been a year and a half since that happened, and I remember clearly that day. He put on cream-colored pants that I had given him and a black t-shirt that was his favorite. At that moment, I felt my heart stop. I couldn't keep to myself what I had seen anymore, and I told her everything. When I told her that the man in front of the church was wearing exactly those clothes, she wasn't surprised. She told me with disturbing calm, "I've seen him too, walking around the house." That night I didn't leave. I stayed with her, sitting in the living room until dawn, so I wouldn't have to pass by that church again at night. The weeks that followed were filled with an eerie sense of being watched. Sometimes, when we were together at her house, she would glance toward the windows or suddenly turn around as if she had heard something. I began to understand that her husband's presence wasn't just a one-time encounter. It was constant, lingering. She would find small things moved around the house, pictures slightly askew, doors that she was certain she had closed standing slightly ajar. His favorite coffee mug would appear on the counter in the morning, even though she always put it away. One evening, as we sat watching television, she suddenly reached for my hand and squeezed it tight. "He's here," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the bedroom. I looked but saw nothing, only shadows dancing in the dim light. But I felt it, a heaviness in the air, a presence that seemed to be evaluating, judging, perhaps even protecting. It wasn't malevolent, but it was undeniably there, a love that transcended death and couldn't quite let go. Eventually, I stopped visiting her house. The weight of sharing space with someone who had never truly left became too much to bear. She understood, and we parted ways quietly, both knowing that some bonds are stronger than the grave, and some love stories continue even when they should have ended. I live in Tucson, Arizona, with my uncles in the Barrio Viejo neighborhood, near the historic district and Sentinel Peak. I'm studying automotive engineering, and what I'm about to tell you happened on September 28th, 2023. That week I was feeling sick to my stomach. I had terrible diarrhea, and that night around 1 in the morning, I woke up to go to the bathroom. I sat on the toilet and was there for quite a while. Between feeling so sick and how late it was, I started to doze off. It was then that the dogs in the street and the neighbors started barking loudly, as if something was agitating them. I thought it was because my uncle's dog was in heat, but the strange thing was that suddenly they all fell silent at the same time. A strange silence took over the street, and then I heard it. A woman's cry, strong, long, heartbreaking. I felt a chill run through my entire body. At that moment, I thought maybe I was going crazy, that I was drowsy in the bathroom, or that maybe it was some fight between neighbors or something worse happening on the street. I finished what I was doing as quickly as I could and left the bathroom. Curiosity got the better of me, so I opened the front door to see what was happening. That's when I got a big surprise. I saw passing down the street the figure of a woman dressed in white like a bride, but wrong somehow. It wasn't something normal, and I felt that immediately. Fear froze me. I quickly closed the door and told myself, trembling, that it was La Llorona. I peeked out again, but she was no longer there. The street was empty, and at that moment my uncle's dog ran toward me and scared me even more. I went into my room almost running and started to pray. I thought that what I had seen might have been people robbing houses, because the Barrio Viejo neighborhood is known for being dangerous sometimes. I even thought about waking my uncle, but I didn't. I couldn't sleep all night. When it was time to get ready for school, I didn't feel like going out. It was still dark when I took the bus, and the experience was still fresh in my mind. At school, I told my classmates what had happened, but no one believed me. Some even ended up making fun of me. That night after dinner, I went out with my uncle for a while to the street. Some kids were playing, and suddenly one of them shouted jokingly, "La Llorona is going to come for us." That comment made me remember everything, and I decided to tell him what had happened to me. My uncle listened seriously, then told me, "You're not the only one. Your aunt and I have also heard her on several occasions." He went on to explain that the neighborhood had a long history with La Llorona. Old-timers said she was drawn to areas near water, and our neighborhood wasn't far from the Santa Cruz River, even though it ran dry most of the year. They said she appeared to those who were alone, especially young men around my age. "She's looking for her children," my uncle said quietly, glancing toward the dark street. "But she's been looking so long, she's forgotten what they look like. Now any young person will do." That night my uncle made sure all the windows were closed tight and that I had a small cross on my nightstand. "Some things," he told me, "are older than the city itself. They don't follow our rules and they don't care about our disbelief. I still live in the same house, but I never go out alone after midnight. And when I hear dogs barking in unison before falling into sudden silence, I make sure to stay far from any windows. Some encounters, I learned, are not meant to be repeated. The children in the neighborhood still joke about La Llorona. but I notice that even they lower their voices when they say her name, and they always look over their shoulders afterward. I was working in a remote area of Atlanta, and at the company where I worked, we had a celebration for the anniversary of its founding. The party extended until very late in the morning, and I found it easier to wait until dawn. That way I would take public transportation back home, but there was still quite a while before that. So a coworker told me he was going back to his parents' house, which was somewhat close to mine, and that I should go with him. I ended up accepting, and when we were near his destination, he said, "I'll drop you off here. Just walk to the next corner and there's a taxi stand there." I said goodbye and took the path, but to get to that corner, I had to pass by the old Westview Cemetery, one of the oldest cemeteries in the city, surrounded by many legends. There was even a legend that if you performed a ritual, you could become the owner of the famous Wren's Nest house nearby. The walls reached approximately 10 feet in height, maybe a little more. It was right there, in that area where the old executions had taken place, that the most shocking thing happened, something related to an old legend. Ahead of me, I saw an elderly woman of very advanced age walking, leaning on a cane that looked more like an old stick. It wasn't strange, since it was a very old neighborhood, one of the first in the city, and there were still families living with their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents. I walked faster and caught up with her, greeting her. "Good morning," to which she responded, "Good yesterday's, son." That response threw me off, and at that moment I realized something disturbing. I was almost running, and she was keeping my pace. That was practically impossible. She had a cane, how could she walk, or rather trot, so fast? Suddenly she jumped and reached the top of the cemetery wall. My heart almost stopped. Then from across the street, a man shouted at me, "Friend, run." It was a worker from the flower market that's right across from there, where he worked all night. I ran into his shop. He closed the doors and asked me, "What was that, friend? Did you throw something, or did something fall on you?" I responded, still trembling, "Neither of the two. It was an old woman." His face changed completely, and he said, "The witch is walking again. Good thing I saw you, kid, because if not, she would have done something to you." Still scared, I asked him if he had seen her before, and he only said, "Since ancient times, it's been said that she returns. She's only known as the Witch of Westview Cemetery." The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the party. Maybe the dim streetlights had played tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. The way she moved, the impossible speed, the leap that defied all logic, it wasn't human. I never took that route again. Even during the day, I would go blocks out of my way to avoid passing by Westview Cemetery. Some things, I learned, are better left undisturbed. And sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble sleeping, I wonder if she's still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to walk by alone in the dark hours before dawn. My name is Marcus, and I've been working as a delivery driver for DoorDash for the past 3 years. It's not the best job in the world, but it's helped me survive. I've covered this city from end to end, day and especially night. Wide streets, narrow alleys, neighborhoods that don't even appear on maps. The city got under my skin like an inevitable routine, like a catchy song that you no longer know if you hate or love. In the early hours, when the hustle dies down and only the whisper of wind through the trees remains, that's when I really feel like I know this place. At that hour, buildings seem taller, shadows longer, and the air heavier, as if the city took off its mask and showed its true face. It's not that I love working nights, but the night shift pays a little better. And during the day's traffic, you slip between lanes as if you owned everything. Actually, I liked feeling that freedom, that false illusion of control, and it made me think nothing bad could happen to me. That night, like so many others, I was on my motorcycle. The helmet was a bit loose, but I'd gotten used to it. My phone was fixed in its mount with the app open, waiting for the next order. I had just delivered some burgers to a housing complex tucked away down south in Phoenix. Nothing unusual. The customer came out, paid in cash, and went back to his apartment. I turned the app back on and started heading north toward downtown. I thought maybe another trip would come up on the way. The streets were almost empty, just a few cars passing now and then, and the streetlights cast shadows that stretched like arms of smoke. The air was cool, humid. That sticky humidity that announces a storm, even though it never quite rains. For me, it was a night like any other, but it wasn't. As I climbed up a narrow street, one of those that seem like secret passages connecting the old with the forgotten, something caught my attention. Right under a yellowish streetlight, where the street narrows so much that two cars can barely pass without brushing against each other, I saw a group of people. They weren't walking, they weren't talking, they weren't doing anything. They were just standing there, forming an almost perfect circle. There were 7 or 8 of them, maybe. What was strange was that they were all looking toward the center, toward the ground, as if observing something invisible but important. From my angle, I couldn't see what it was, and it seemed odd but not alarming. At first, I thought someone might have fainted, that someone was having some kind of emergency. But there was no movement. They weren't bending down. They weren't doing anything. They were just looking. Total silence, no murmur at all. I slowed down more by instinct than anything else. At those hours, it's not common to see groups gathered on the street, and especially not like this, in complete silence. I got too close without taking my eyes off the center of the circle. I was trying to understand what they were looking at, and then I noticed something that gave me goosebumps. I couldn't see their faces well. The streetlight illuminated them, but the light didn't seem to touch their faces. It was as if they were right at the line of shadow, that thin line between the visible and the impossible. But something else disturbed me. They had no expression. They showed no sadness, no joy, no anger. They were empty faces like made of wax. They didn't seem asleep, nor fully alive either. I stared at them for just an instant, no more than a blink. And in that instant, it was enough for everything to go to hell. I heard nothing, saw no lights. I just felt the impact, a brutal, dry blow as if a wall had fallen on me. The car hit me head-on and the motorcycle went flying. I did too, and I remember the helmet breaking when it hit the pavement. My back bounced against the ground, and then everything was a constant buzzing, like bees inside my skull, mixed with a metallic taste in my mouth. It was blood and pain, lights flashing in my eyes like broken fireworks. I lay on the asphalt, face up and motionless. I felt the world spinning around me, but I wasn't moving. The streetlight was still there, casting its pale and trembling light, as if it too feared going out. And then I saw them. Now they were looking at me. They hadn't approached, they hadn't moved at all. They were just there, looking at me as if they had always been waiting for that moment. And then I understood. The exact spot where I had fallen was the same point they had been observing before. Right there, as if they knew, as if they had been anticipating it every second. Their eyes were dark, sunken like bottomless wells. I don't know if it was the shadow or the streetlight, but they didn't shine, didn't blink, showed nothing. And yet I saw something in their gaze that cut me deep. It wasn't hate, it wasn't pity, it wasn't compassion either. It was a kind of silent certainty, as if I was just fulfilling something inevitable, as if long before I arrived, they already knew I was going to end up there, lying in front of them, broken and bleeding. And the worst part wasn't that. The worst part was realizing that for a moment I knew it too, and suddenly they were gone. They didn't walk away, they didn't disappear into smoke. They simply vanished, as if someone had erased a part of the world. The circle dissolved without moving, and the streetlight was left illuminating only the empty pavement. For a moment I doubted if they had really been there. But no, I saw them, I felt them, and I still remember them. I don't know how much time passed after that. I heard a siren in the distance, then some voices. They put me in the ambulance carefully, as if carrying something broken. At the hospital, they told me I had a fractured leg and a mild concussion. Nothing serious for the blow I'd taken. It even seemed like a miracle. The doctor asked me if I remembered the accident, and I said yes. But I didn't mention anything about the group under the streetlight. Not a single word. I didn't tell the police either. What was I going to say? That it was the blow, that I had imagined everything. Since that night, I don't go out to deliver after 10 o'clock. I say the motorcycle is failing, that I have another job, that I'm resting. And although everyone accepts those excuses, the truth is different. I don't want to go back through that street. I don't want to see a group of people standing under a streetlight, looking at something that isn't there. Or worse, looking at me. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.